She ended a 3-year relationship with a single text message. No phone call, no explanation, just 12 words on a screen at 11:47 on a Tuesday night. And Brian Carter's entire life collapsed in the space it took to read them. He didn't see it coming. That's the part that still broke him, months later. Not just the leaving, but the silence that followed. No argument, no warning, nothing to hold on to. Just a door closing so quietly, he didn't realize it was gone until the cold came through. If you've ever loved someone who disappeared without looking back, this story is for you. Watch until the end. Hit like if something in this moves you. And drop a comment with the city you're watching from. I want to see just how far this story travels. The rain had been falling since early afternoon, the kind of Chicago rain that didn't bother with drama. No thunder, no lightning, just a steady gray curtain that soaked through everything and made the whole city feel like it was grieving. Brian Carter sat in the driver's seat of his 2014 Nissan Altima in the parking lot of a Jewel Osco on North Clark Street and stared at the dashboard like it owed him something. The engine had made a noise about 6 minutes ago, a wet, grinding cough from somewhere deep in the hood, and then gone silent. Not a stutter, not a slow decline, just done. Like it had decided, quietly and without negotiation, that it wasn't going anywhere. He turned the key again. Nothing. He turned it a third time, which he knew was useless but did anyway, because that's what you do when something won't cooperate and you're already having the kind of day that started badly and is finishing worse. Nothing. He let go of the key and sat back and watched the rain hit the windshield in long, diagonal streaks. Outside, a woman in a yellow raincoat was loading groceries into a minivan 2 spaces over. She had a system. Bags by category. Everything deliberate. She didn't look up. Nobody in a parking lot ever looks up unless something's on fire. Brian's phone was at 14%. He had $19 in his checking account until Friday, and Friday was 3 days away. And even if he called a tow truck, he wasn't sure where he'd tell them to take the car because he couldn't afford the diagnostic fee at the shop on Damon that his buddy Marcus had recommended 3 months ago, and he still hadn't gotten around to going. He pressed his forehead against the steering wheel. In the back seat, there was a booster chair with a faded Lightning McQueen sticker on the armrest. His son Danny's. Danny was 6 years old and currently at Brian's mother's place on the south side, which was good because the last thing a 6-year-old needed was to sit in a broken car in a grocery store parking lot in the rain watching his dad slowly come apart at the seams. Brian didn't think of himself as someone coming apart at the seams. He thought of himself as someone holding it together. He went to work. He picked Danny up from school. He made dinner most nights. Not great dinner, pasta and jarred sauce, frozen pizza, eggs 3 different ways, but dinner. He did the laundry on Sundays. He paid the bills mostly on time. He was, by any functional measure, doing fine. But doing fine and being fine were different things. And in the particular silence of a dead car in a gray parking lot on a Wednesday in November, the distance between those two things felt very wide. He'd been broken up with Chloe Bennett for 4 months. 4 months and 11 days, if he was counting, which he told himself he wasn't, but clearly was. The text had come at 11:47 p.m. on a Tuesday. He remembered the time because he'd looked at the clock right before his phone buzzed, doing that half-awake calculation of whether he had time to fall asleep before his alarm, and then the buzz came and he'd read it, and after that sleeping was not something that happened. I think we need to go our separate ways. I'm sorry. I hope you and Danny are okay. That was it. 12 words and a period and a period. 3 years. 2 of which he'd spent genuinely believing she might be the woman he'd build his life around. And she'd wrapped it up in a text message she could have sent to a customer service department. He'd called her immediately. It rang 4 times and went to voicemail. He'd texted back, "Can we talk about this? Please just call me." She'd seen it. The little read receipt appeared at 11:51. She never responded. He tried twice more over the next week. Both times, read, no reply. Then her number went to a generic voicemail message, which either meant she'd blocked him or changed her phone, and after a while he stopped trying because there's only so many times a person can reach towards something that's not there before it starts to feel like a problem with the reaching. The worst part, or one of the worst parts because there were several to choose from, was that he'd never really understood why. They'd had a difficult stretch, sure, Her job at the marketing firm had gotten more demanding, and his hours at the architectural firm where he worked as a junior draftsman were unpredictable, and Danny was going through a phase where he needed more, and they'd argued about that, about time and attention and who was carrying what. But people argued. That was relationships. They'd been through worse and come through fine. And then one Tuesday night, she was just gone, and Brian was left standing in the ruin of something he hadn't seen ending, holding a 6-year-old who kept asking where Chloe was and getting told for months now that she was very busy with work. He sat up and looked at his phone. 14%. He should call his mom. Or Marcus. He should do something practical. Instead, he opened his texts by accident. Old habit, the thumb going where it always went. And Chloe's name was still right there at the top of the list. Because he hadn't deleted the conversation. Because deleting it felt like agreeing that it was over. And some part of him hadn't fully agreed yet. I think we need to go our separate ways. He closed the phone and put it face down on the passenger seat. The rain kept falling. He was trying to decide between calling his mom and just sitting here until something changed, which was not a rational strategy, but sometimes you needed a few minutes before rational, when his phone buzzed. He assumed it was Marcus, who had a habit of texting at inconvenient moments with sports takes, or his mom checking on Danny's pickup time. He picked it up without looking and swiped to unlock it. The name stopped him. Victoria Hale. He stared at it for a second like it was in a language he didn't speak. Victoria Hale. He had her number because Chloe had made him save it about a year ago. Just in case of emergencies, she travels a lot, and sometimes she's the only one who picks up. And he'd put it in his phone and never thought about it again. And Victoria had never once texted him in all the time he'd known Chloe, which wasn't much because Chloe and her mother had a relationship that was civil and mostly distant, like two people who'd agreed to be polite without being close. He opened the message. Brian, I heard your car broke down on Clark. My driver spotted you in the Jewel Osco lot on his way back from an errand. He recognized your car from when you used to pick Chloe up at the house. Are you all right? Do you need a ride somewhere? Brian read it twice. He looked up through the rain-streaked windshield at the parking lot, half expecting to see a black car idling somewhere nearby, which was, he registered, slightly strange. Being spotted by someone's driver and having that someone immediately text you was a specific kind of wealth behavior that he didn't encounter often in his daily life. He typed back, I'm okay, just waiting on a tow. But thank you. Which was not true on any count. He wasn't okay, he wasn't waiting on a tow, and the thank you was reflexive. Her response came in under a minute. Don't be polite. You've been sitting there for at least 10 minutes and the temperature is dropping. Marcus can pull around. He's already close. Where do you need to go? Brian looked at his phone for a long moment. He thought about saying no again. He almost did. There was something uncomfortable about the whole situation. Accepting help from Chloe's mother, of all people, in a parking lot in the rain, 4 months after Chloe had ended things without the courtesy of a conversation. It felt like a story with complicated implications. It felt like exactly the kind of thing he should politely decline. But the car was dead. He had $19. It was 41 degrees and raining, and he was 3 miles from home, and Danny needed to be picked up from his mom's by 6. He texted back, My apartment on Belden. I really appreciate this. 5 minutes, she wrote back. Don't get wet. The car that pulled up was a black Lincoln Navigator with tinted windows, and a driver named Marcus, who was about 60 years old, had a shaved head and a gray beard, and said exactly 2 things during the entire drive. Mr. Carter? When Brian got in, and we're here, when they stopped in front of his building. Brian appreciated this. He wasn't in the mood for conversation, and Marcus seemed to understand that without being told. He'd thanked Victoria again by text while Marcus drove, and she'd replied, It's nothing. I hope you can get the car sorted. And then a pause, and then, Take care of yourself. That last part was what he kept looking at. Not because it was remarkable. It was a completely ordinary thing to say. People said take care of yourself the way they said, have a good one, reflexively, without weight. But Victoria Hale had never in 3 years texted him anything, and now she'd sent 4 messages, and the last one was take care of yourself, and something about it felt, he couldn't explain it exactly, like it meant something, or like it was trying to. He went upstairs and changed into dry clothes and called his mom to confirm pickup. He ate a bowl of cereal standing over the sink because the table had a stack of Danny's drawings on it, and he hadn't had the energy to move them. He looked up the cost of a tow and a diagnostic at 2 different shops, and then closed the browser because the numbers made him feel tired. At 5:15, his phone buzzed. Victoria Hale. I know this is probably odd, but I wanted to check that you made it home okay. And I don't know why I'm saying this. I'm sorry about what happened with Chloe. I know that's probably not helpful to hear from her mother, but I mean it. Brian sat down on the couch. He read the message 3 times. There were a lot of things he could say in response. He could say thanks, I appreciate it. He could say it's fine, these things happen. He could say nothing and let it go and wake up tomorrow and this would just be a strange Wednesday that he eventually stopped thinking about. He typed, "It's not odd, and thank you for saying that. She didn't really give me much of an explanation, so I've been mostly just trying to figure out what happened, I guess." He stared at what he'd written. It was more honest than he'd intended. He almost deleted it and replaced it with something easier. He sent it. Her response took a few minutes, longer than the others. I know, and I can't speak for her. That's not my place. But I know that what she did wasn't right. You deserved better than that. Brian held the phone in his hand and didn't answer right away. He thought about how strange it was. The most direct acknowledgement he'd gotten from anyone in 4 months, and it came from Chloe's mother, in a text, after a stranger in a black car pulled him out of a rainy parking lot. Life had a way of arranging things without regard for what made narrative sense. Thank you, he finally wrote. That actually means something. He didn't expect to hear from her again. That's the thing about moments that feel meaningful in the present. You never know which ones are standalone and which ones are beginnings until you're already past the point of easy exit. 3 days later, on a Saturday afternoon while Danny was at a birthday party for a kid from his class, Brian's phone buzzed. Victoria Hale. Completely random question. Have you sorted out the car situation? He hadn't. The tow alone had cost $90 he'd put on a credit card, and the shop on Damon had called to tell him the alternator was going, and the estimate was $480 in parts and labor, and he told them to hold off while he figured it out. He told her this. More than he'd planned to tell her probably, because she asked a direct question, and he'd gotten used to people asking how are you without wanting a real answer, and it was almost disorienting when someone asked something specific. She called him, not a text, an actual phone call, which caught him off guard enough that he answered before he decided whether to. I have someone, she said without preamble. Her voice was low and even, not warm exactly, but not cold either, precise. The voice of someone who made decisions for a living and had stopped padding them. A mechanic I use for my personal cars. He's good, he's honest, and he owes me a favor. Let me make a call and see if he can get to you by Tuesday. Victoria. He'd never called her by her first name out loud before. It felt strange in his mouth, not wrong, just unfamiliar, like trying on something that fit, but that you'd never worn. You don't have to do this. I know I don't have to, she said. I'm offering because it makes sense. You need the car for Danny, right? Yeah. Then let me make the call. He didn't argue further. He wasn't sure if it was because the offer was practical and he was tired of struggling unnecessarily, or because her directness was oddly comfortable, or because there was something in her voice that made you feel like the conversation had already been decided and you were just catching up. Okay, he said. Thank you. Don't thank me yet. He might not be available. A pause. How's Danny? The question surprised him more than the offer had. He's good, Brian said, and then, because she'd asked with what sounded like genuine curiosity, he's at a birthday party right now. Kid named Oliver from his first grade class. There was a whole discussion about what present to get. Danny was very serious about it. We went to 3 stores. He heard something that might have been a quiet laugh. Not a big one. More like a sound that slipped out before she caught it. Chloe used to be the same way about presents, Victoria said. Extremely specific opinions. She once made me drive to 3 different stores for a birthday gift when she was 7. We were in the car for 2 hours. The sentence landed somewhere soft. It was the first time either of them had mentioned Chloe by name in the conversation. Neither of them commented on that. Brian wasn't sure if it was intentional or just the natural shape of where the conversation went. but it hung there for a moment before Victoria continued. I'll make the call tonight. Text me the make and model and I'll pass it along. Nissan Altima, 2014. Got it. Another pause, shorter than the last. Take care of yourself, Brian. There it was again. He didn't know why she kept saying it. He didn't know if she said it to everyone. But it landed the same way it had in the text, like it was weighted, like the words were actually about something. Like when she said, take care of yourself, she was specifically talking about him and not just performing the exit ritual of a phone call. You too, he said. She hung up. He sat on the couch in the quiet apartment for a while. And outside the window, Chicago was doing its November thing, gray sky, bare trees, the occasional car moving through the slush on Belden. And he thought about the fact that the most substantive conversation he'd had with another adult in weeks had just been with the mother of the woman who'd walked out on him without explanation. He thought about what that said about his life right now, and then he decided not to think about it anymore and went to do the dishes. The mechanic's name was Pete. He came on Tuesday, exactly when Victoria said he would, drove the car to his shop and had it back by Thursday with a bill that was $210 instead of $480, which Pete explained with a shrug and said Victoria had covered the difference, which Brian didn't find out until he was already home and couldn't reasonably return the money. He texted her immediately. You didn't have to do that. I know, she wrote back. Consider it an apology for my daughter. He stared at that for a long time. Then, you don't owe me an apology for someone else's choices. Maybe not, but someone should give you one. The Tuesday after that, she texted to ask if he'd eaten dinner. It was the kind of question that should have felt invasive from a relative stranger. It didn't. It felt like someone paying attention, and he was surprised to realize how long it had been since someone outside of his immediate family had paid attention to him in a way that was just attentive, not obligated, not because they needed something back. I had cereal, he wrote, because it was true. That's not dinner. Have you eaten a real meal today? Define real. Something that requires a stove. Then no. A pause. There's a Thai place on Diversey called Lotus Garden. I eat there sometimes when I'm working late. The tom kha is good and they're open until 10. You should go. Are you telling me to go get soup? I'm suggesting it. But you should. You probably don't eat enough. He laughed out loud in his empty apartment. Not a big laugh. A small, startled one. The kind that catches you off guard. How do you know how much I eat? I don't. I'm making a judgment based on the cereal. He went to Lotus Garden. He sat at a two-person table by the window and ate tom kha soup and watched the street. And it was, objectively, a very ordinary meal. But he hadn't sat in a restaurant by himself in months, maybe longer. He'd gotten used to eating standing up or in the car or in front of his laptop while Danny was asleep, eating as an act of bare maintenance rather than anything else. The soup was good. He texted her a photo of the bowl. She wrote back, good. Go again sometime. He started noticing small things about her texts. The way she asked questions that were specific rather than general. Not how are you, but how did the Belden project go after he'd mentioned a work assignment offhandedly 2 messages earlier. The fact that she apparently remembered the small details he gave her, held on to them, brought them back. The precision of her language. She didn't hedge unnecessarily, didn't soften things with filler words, said what she meant and stopped. He didn't know much about her life, practically. He knew she was the CEO of Hale Capital Partners, which was a private equity firm he'd only vaguely heard of, which meant it was either very successful or very discreet, and was probably both. He knew she lived in Lincoln Park, in a house he'd driven Chloe to once or twice, and registered as big without fully registering what big meant in that neighborhood. He knew she traveled constantly. She mentioned being in New York on a Monday, London the following Thursday, back in Chicago by the weekend. And he knew her schedule was demanding in a way that made his own long hours feel modest by comparison. What he didn't know, and what he found himself curious about in a way he didn't quite examine, was who she was when she wasn't being that. When she wasn't the CEO making calls and sending drivers and covering alternator costs without mentioning it. Who she was at 10 o'clock on a Wednesday when she was recommending tom kha soup to a man she barely knew. He asked her once, indirectly, "Do you ever just sit down and do nothing?" Her response came after a longer pause than usual. I used to be better at it. I'm not anymore. I'm not sure when that happened. Maybe you should try the soup strategy. Go sit somewhere and just eat. Is that your advice? Seems to be working for me. Another pause. Maybe I will, she wrote. 4 weeks after the parking lot, she invited him to lunch. Not with ceremony. She mentioned she was going to be near his office on Thursday for a meeting and asked if he was free at noon, same casual register as the soup recommendation, the kind of thing you could easily say no to. He almost said no. He spent about 40 minutes thinking about why he should say no and whether there was something appropriate to question about it, whether it was strange, whether it would mean something it shouldn't. He told himself it wasn't strange. She'd been generous to him in a practical way. They'd built something that resembled a friendship through texts, and people had lunch. That's a thing adults did. Lunch. It didn't require explanation. He said yes. The restaurant was a place on Ontario Street, small and quiet, the kind of restaurant where the tables were far enough apart that you could have a real conversation. Victoria was already there when he arrived. She was always early, he would come to understand. Early being for her a form of control over a schedule that was otherwise managing her. She was wearing a dark blazer over a gray shirt, her hair pulled back, and she looked, Brian processed this in the moment without quite knowing how to think about it, like herself. Like someone who'd arrived at a particular version of themselves and stopped negotiating with it. She stood to greet him, and they did the brief, slightly awkward calibration of whether it was a handshake or a brief hug, and landed on neither. Just a mutual acknowledgement that came out as a small wave, and then both of them sitting down at the same time. You look better than the parking lot, she said. The bar was very low, he said. She almost smiled. Not quite. A corner of her mouth moved. How's the car? Running. Danny keeps calling Pete the car doctor. This time she did smile, and it changed her face more than he expected. Made her look younger, or maybe just less managed. Like something that was usually contained had briefly come loose. Danny sounds like a good kid, she said. He's the best part of my life, Brian said. And it came out simply, without emphasis, the way you say a thing that's just true and doesn't need defending. He's also exhausting and dramatic, and he recently informed me that ketchup on eggs is disgusting and I need to change, so... He's 6? 6.5. The half is very important. He'll correct you. Chloe was like that, Victoria said. Every half birthday was a thing. She'd get up in the morning and announce it. She said it easily this time, Chloe's name, like they'd gotten past the moment of it being a careful thing. Brian looked at her across the table. Can I ask you something? She didn't tense, just looked at him with that steady, direct attention. Go ahead. Do you know why she did it? The text, I mean. Just ending it like that with no conversation? He told himself he wasn't going to ask this. It felt like using the friendship, or whatever this was, as a conduit for answers he was owed by someone else. But the question had been sitting in him for months, and he was tired of carrying it. Victoria was quiet for a moment, not uncomfortable, thoughtful. She had the habit of not speaking until she was ready, which was unusual enough in his experience that he'd started to find it reassuring rather than strange. Chloe does this, she said finally. When something gets complicated or painful, she exits. She's been doing it since she was a teenager. It's not something she thought carefully about doing to you specifically. It's just the shape of how she handles things that overwhelm her. She paused, which I'm aware doesn't make it hurt less. No, Brian said, but it helps. Knowing it wasn't personal? Knowing I didn't miss something obvious. He looked down at the menu without reading it. I've been going over it for months, looking for the thing I did wrong that I should have seen coming, and I've never been able to find it. Because it wasn't there, Victoria said. You didn't do something wrong that caused that text, Brian. She was afraid of something and she ran from it. That's different. Brian looked up at her. How do you know that? He said. How do you know it was fear? Because I know her, she said, and then something shifted in her expression. Not closed, but complicated, like she was hearing herself say something she'd been avoiding. And because I recognize it, the running. I've done it too. Not the same way, but the same reason. He waited. She didn't explain further. Not then. She picked up the menu and said, The short rib here is very good. And the conversation moved on, and Brian let it, because there are things people offer you when they're not quite ready to offer them yet, and the right thing to do is not push. But he heard what she'd said. I recognize it. The running, I've done it too. The lunch lasted 2 hours. Neither of them mentioned the time until the restaurant was nearly empty around them, and a busboy was making pointed eye contact with the table next to theirs. They talked about his work. He was finishing up the detailed drawings for a residential addition in Wicker Park, modest project, but he was proud of some of the decisions they'd made about light. She asked good questions about it, technical questions that suggested she'd worked with architects before, or simply had the habit of learning whatever room she was in. They talked about Danny's school, about a project Danny had done on penguins that Brian had photographed and sent him a picture of, which Victoria asked to see and then studied with genuine attention. They talked about her company briefly. She described it with the shorthand of someone who's explained it so many times that the explaining had become automatic, but then caught herself and described it differently, as if she were actually thinking about it from the outside. We buy underperforming companies, restructure them, and either hold them or sell them. The polite version is that we help businesses reach their potential. The honest version is that we're very good at finding what's broken and fixing it, and not everyone likes that process. Do you? Brian asked. Do I what? Like it. The process. What you do. She considered this with the same careful pause she gave everything. I'm very good at it, she said, which is not quite the same answer. He nodded. I was, she said, and then stopped, and then tried again. When I started, I liked it because I could see the shape of a problem, and I could solve it. And that felt purposeful, but somewhere in the last, decade, the solving became the whole point, the doing of it, not the reason. She set her glass down. That's probably more than you were asking. No, he said. That's exactly what I was asking. She looked at him for a moment, then, You're easy to talk to. That surprised me. Was that in question? You're a man I know almost nothing about, who I texted in a parking lot on an impulse because my driver pointed you out, and I don't actually know why I thought I should help. She said this without apology, just cataloging the facts. I'm not usually impulsive. What made you do it? She was quiet for a moment. I'd been hearing about you for 3 years through Chloe, which means I'd heard her version of you, which was not unfair to you, but limited. And then my driver says, that's her ex-boyfriend sitting in the rain with a broken car. And I don't know. I thought, she paused. I thought that nobody was going to help him if I didn't. And that seemed wrong. Brian looked at her. Thank you, he said, for the parking lot and everything since. Don't make it sentimental, she said, but without sharpness. Almost gentle, actually. I was in the area and I had a driver. He smiled. She looked at him for a moment more and then looked away at the restaurant. And he couldn't read what was in her expression, only that there was something there she wasn't saying, and that she'd decided not to say it, and that the decision had cost something small. He picked Danny up at 5:30, and they made grilled cheese for dinner, which Danny ate in approximately 90 seconds, and then wanted to watch a show about animal rescues. They sat on the couch together, Danny pressed against Brian's side, radiating the unconscious warmth of a small person who still climbed onto you without asking, who still assumed contact was available, and Brian watched the show without fully seeing it. He thought about Victoria saying, I recognize it. The running. He thought about 2 hours disappearing in a restaurant and not noticing until the busboys started getting pointed. He thought about the way she'd asked to see Danny's penguin project and studied it like it mattered. Nobody did that with pictures of other people's kids' school projects. You smiled and said that's adorable and moved on. She'd actually looked at it. She'd asked what kind of penguin it was. He didn't know what to call what was happening. He wasn't sure he needed to call it anything yet. Danny fell asleep against his shoulder sometime around 7:30, mid-sentence about something a penguin had done on the show. Brian sat in the blue light of the television for a while and didn't move because Danny was warm and heavy against him, and there was something about the weight of a sleeping kid that made everything feel briefly settled. His phone was on the cushion beside him. He picked it up and opened his texts without thinking about whether it was a good idea. He typed, I had a good time today. He sent it before he could decide not to. Her response came 12 minutes later, So did I, more than I expected. He stared at that for a moment. Then, is that a surprise? A longer pause this time. A little, she wrote. Yes. He turned off the TV and carried Danny to bed and spent the next hour staring at the ceiling of his bedroom in the particular dark of a Chicago November night, the city making its constant low noise outside, and somewhere in between thinking too much about what any of this meant and thinking he probably shouldn't think about it, he fell asleep. The weeks that followed built on each other the way small things do, incrementally, without any single moment you could point to and say, there, that's when it changed. He found himself telling her things he didn't usually tell people, not secrets exactly, just the actual texture of his days. The call from Danny's teacher about a minor altercation at recess, and the whole complicated conversation he'd had with Danny afterward about why you don't push someone even if they took your colored pencil. The presentation at work that he thought went badly and turned out to have gone fine. The fact that he'd started going back to the gym on Tuesday and Thursday mornings, and how strange it felt to be in a room full of people doing a physical thing he'd stopped doing for a year and a half. She told him things too. Not as freely. She was, by temperament and probably by necessity, someone who held most of herself back, but in pieces, here and there, the way someone drops something they didn't mean to and then keeps walking. She told him her ex-husband Daniel Hale, who was Chloe's father, had been out of her life for 15 years but still found ways to be a presence in it, usually through Chloe, which complicated things. She told him she had a house in Lincoln Park with 6 bedrooms that she mostly used for working in different rooms, which she said with enough detachment that he wasn't sure if it was a complaint or just information. She told him once that she'd had a close friend, a woman named Roslyn, who she'd known since graduate school, and that Roslyn had moved to Portland 3 years ago, and that they'd drifted in the way people drift, not with a falling out, but just with distance, and that she missed her more than she'd admitted to anyone. Brian was usually the one who asked about Roslyn. Victoria didn't volunteer it, but he'd asked once and she'd answered, and then he asked again another time and she answered again, and she seemed to understand that he was going to keep asking, not to push her, but because he was actually curious, and that made him different from most people in her life who took her at the surface because the surface was what she offered. She came to the gym on the Thursday of the 4th week, not to exercise. She'd been walking from a meeting 2 blocks away and texted him on impulse, "I'm near your gym. Do you have 30 minutes?" And he'd met her in the lobby, and they'd ended up sitting in the coffee shop next door in their respective coats, her in the blazer and tailored coat, him still in his gym clothes, and had a conversation that lasted the rest of his lunch hour. She looked in the unguarded light of a coffee shop like a person who was tired in a way that wasn't physical. Not worn down, not falling apart, just carrying something heavy and having done it for long enough that it was harder to set down than pick up. "When did you last take a vacation?" he asked. "Define vacation." "A trip where you don't work." "I don't do those." "Why?" She picked up her cup and put it down and said, without any particular emphasis, "Because when I stop, I have to be somewhere, and the somewhere is usually quiet. And when it's quiet, I notice things I've been too busy to notice." A pause. "And some of those things I'd rather not notice." He didn't ask what things. He'd learned the difference between the gaps she left because she wanted him to ask and the ones she left because she was still deciding. "That sounds exhausting," he said instead, "keeping busy to avoid being somewhere." "It is." She looked at him. "It works, though, as a strategy. Until it doesn't. Everything works until it doesn't." He looked back at her. Outside the coffee shop window, Chicago was doing its early December thing, Christmas lights going up on a storefront across the street, a couple sharing an umbrella that wasn't big enough for both of them getting wet. The city's casual indifference to whether you were comfortable. "Can I say something?" he said. "You've never asked for permission before. This is different." He looked at the window for a moment and then back at her. "I don't know what this is, whatever this is that we've been doing, and I'm not saying I need to name it or that anything has to be different, but I want you to know that the thing you're describing, being busy so you don't have to stop somewhere, you don't have to do that when you're talking to me." She was very still for a moment. "Brian, I know, I'm not saying anything, I'm just saying you can be somewhere when we talk, that's all." She looked at him for a long moment, and whatever he saw in her face was not the controlled executive expression she usually wore. It was something undefended, something that had been waiting behind the other thing for a while, and it passed through her face quickly, less than a second, before the composure came back. But he saw it. "Okay," she said, quietly. "Just that." He nodded. Outside, the couple with the inadequate umbrella had stopped walking and were standing under an awning, laughing about something, the wet not mattering anymore. Brian looked back at his coffee. He didn't name what he'd felt when her face had opened like that. He stored it somewhere careful and deliberately didn't look directly at it. But it was there, and he knew they'd both felt it. He didn't tell Marcus about Victoria, which was notable mostly because he told Marcus almost everything. And Marcus's absence of knowledge about this particular development was something Brian maintained with quiet effort. Not because it was secret exactly, because saying it out loud would require him to explain it, and he couldn't explain it. And he wasn't ready for Marcus's inevitable collection of questions and opinions, delivered with the bluntness of a man who had no interest in tact and considered this a virtue. He did tell his mother, accidentally, in the way you tell someone something you didn't mean to by saying something adjacent to it. His mother, Beverly Carter, 61, retired school administrator, woman with eyes that missed nothing, had called on a Sunday afternoon to check in, and somewhere in the conversation she'd asked if he was seeing anyone. "No," he said. "Are you interested in anyone?" And he'd hesitated. Half a second, not more. "Brian," his mother said. "It's nothing. It's not—" "Who is it?" "Mom." "Bree." He'd rubbed his face and said, "It's not a thing. She's Chloe's mom." The silence on his mother's end had a particular texture. "Brian Allen Carter," she said. "It's not a thing," he said again. "We talk. That's all." "How old is she?" "Mom." "How old?" 55. Another silence. "That's a full-grown woman," Beverly Carter said. "I know how old she is. And she's Chloe's mother." "I'm aware." "Brian." His mother's voice shifted from pointed to something quieter, more careful. "Are you happy when you talk to her?" He thought about Victoria in the coffee shop, Victoria's face when she'd let something through. "Yeah," he said. "I am." "Well," Beverly Carter was quiet for a moment. "That's its own thing. That's separate." "From what?" "From whether it's complicated," his mother said. "Things can be both. Happy and complicated. That's allowed." He thought about that for a long time after they hung up. Things can be both. That's allowed. No. The night everything shifted was the third Thursday of December. It had been building without either of them acknowledging it was building, the way water rises, gradually, and then all at once when you're not watching. She'd called him, actually called, which she still did only occasionally, the phone calls being something different from the texts, more immediate, less edited. At 7:30 to say she was stuck at the office and had a headache that she'd had since noon and had eaten nothing since a meeting at 2, and could he— She said it a little oddly, like she was suggesting something she wasn't sure she was allowed to suggest. Could he come by? Not to the office, to her house. He'd gotten his mom to stay with Danny, which Beverly Carter agreed to with unusual lack of commentary, only saying, "Okay, go," like she'd been expecting the call. The house on Lincoln Park was larger than he remembered from dropping Chloe off. A 4-story gray stone with a black door and a small porch, set back from the street behind a stone wall, inside which there was a garden that was bare and gray in December, but that you could see had structure. The kind of garden someone had designed carefully and had been maintaining for a long time. She opened the door before he knocked. She was in different clothes than the blazer. Dark pants and a soft gray sweater, and her hair was down, which he'd never seen, and it changed her in a way he registered physically before intellectually. She looked, without the armor of the work clothes and the pulled-back hair, like someone who lived in the house, like someone who was home. "You didn't have to come," she said. You asked me to." "I know, but you didn't have to." "Victoria," he said, "I'm here." She stepped back to let him in. The house was warm and quiet, the kind of quiet that has scale, where you can tell from the way sound moves that there's a lot of space, that the rooms go back further than you can see. There was a lit lamp in the foyer and another down the hallway, and everything else was dim, and it smelled like— He couldn't place it exactly. Something understated. Old wood and something floral that was probably from a candle somewhere. She led him to the kitchen, which was the only room that looked genuinely lived in. There was a half-empty glass of water on the counter and a legal pad with handwritten notes, and her laptop open to a spreadsheet that she'd clearly been working on from home. "I have food," she said, opening the refrigerator and staring into it with the expression of someone who'd forgotten what food was. "I think." "Sit down," he said. She turned to look at him. "You have a headache and you haven't eaten since 2, he said. "Sit down. I'll figure it out." She sat down at the kitchen island without arguing, which was how he knew she was tired in a way she hadn't said, because Victoria Hale did not, in his experience, accept being managed without at least one counter volley. He found eggs, half a block of sharp cheddar, some wilted scallions that were borderline but edible, a few slices of bread. He made scrambled eggs with cheese and toasted the bread and poured a glass of water and set it in front of her without saying anything about it. She looked at the plate. "This is the second time you've made me eat something," she said. "The soup was your idea." "It was. This is yours." He sat across from her at the island and didn't say anything while she ate. She was a careful eater, he noticed. Not slow, just deliberate, like she was paying attention to it. When was the last time she'd eaten like this? He suspected she ate a lot of meals at conference tables. He suspected she ate a lot of meals in transit, in cars, on planes, with her phone in her hand. "Thank you," she said when she was almost done. I don't know why scrambled eggs are this good right now, but they are. Low blood sugar and a headache will do it." She looked up at him. Something shifted in the room without making a sound. It wasn't a dramatic thing. He didn't know how to describe it except to say that whatever distance had been between them, maintained politely, thoughtfully, with mutual agreement that it was the right thing to maintain, was slightly less than it had been a moment before. Like two things that had been pulled apart by careful hands, and now one of the hands had let go. "Brian," she said. "Yeah." She looked at the plate and then back at him. "I don't know what to do with this," she said. She didn't say what this was. She didn't need to. He was quiet for a moment. "Me neither," he said. She nodded once, like that was both difficult and necessary to say out loud. "You're 23 years younger than me," she said. "You're my daughter's ex-boyfriend." "I know. Those aren't small things." "I know that too." She looked at him steadily. Whatever was in her expression was not the controlled executive, not the woman with the driver and the 6-bedroom house who knew what to do. It was, she looked in the warm kitchen light like someone who was standing at an edge and had not yet decided what to do about it. "I haven't let anyone in," she said. "In a very long time. It's not—" She stopped, started again. "I'm not sure I know how to do it without it going wrong." He looked at her and thought about the parking lot and the alternator and the soup and the lunch and the coffee shop and her face when something had come through it in that unguarded instant, and he thought, this woman has been running for a long time. "You've been letting me in," he said, "the whole time. You just haven't stopped to notice." She held his gaze for a long moment. Then she looked down, and something moved through her face. Not the controlled version, something real, something that had been held down for a while and was tired. "Yeah," she said quietly. "I know." Outside, the wind was picking up, rattling the windows, the city making its winter noise. The kitchen was warm and still, and the lamp above the island cast everything in a particular gold. Neither of them moved. Neither of them moved away. Neither of them moved away. That was the thing Brian kept coming back to in the days that followed. Not what was said in Victoria's kitchen that night, because what was said was careful and incomplete, and full of the kind of pauses that do more work than words. What stayed with him was the fact that they'd both been sitting there at the edge of something that should have made one or both of them stand up and find a reason to leave, and neither of them had. He'd driven home at 10:30 with the windows down despite the December cold, needing the air, needing something to interrupt the particular silence that had settled in his chest. Not an unpleasant silence, which was the part that complicated things. It wasn't the silence of dread or regret. It was the silence of something that had been named, finally, after weeks of circling it, and naming it had made the room smaller and the distance between two people shorter, and now he had to figure out what to do with that. He didn't figure it out that night. He picked Danny up from his mother's, who said nothing but looked at him in a way that suggested she was exercising significant restraint, and he drove home with Danny asleep in the back seat, and the city moving past the windows, and thought, I don't know what I'm doing. Which was true, but it was a different kind of not knowing than before. Before, not knowing had felt like being lost. This felt more like standing at a trailhead in the dark, knowing the trail was there but not being able to see it yet. Victoria texted him at 11:14 after he'd put Danny to bed and was sitting on the couch doing nothing. Thank you for tonight, I mean the eggs, but also the rest of it. He wrote back, any time. A pause. Brian. Just his name. Like a question without a question mark. I know, he wrote, because he did. She didn't respond after that, and he didn't push. And in the morning, life was what it always was. Danny needed breakfast. The Wicker Park drawings needed revisions. The alternator was holding, but the check engine light was on again for reasons he hadn't diagnosed yet. The practical machinery of a person's life doesn't pause for emotional reckoning. It just keeps going, and you keep going with it. And somewhere in between the school drop-off and the revision markup and the third cup of coffee, you find the space to think about what's happening to you. He found that space on his lunch break, sitting in a taco place on Kinsey Street, and what he thought was this. Victoria Hale is 23 years older than me. She is the mother of my ex-girlfriend who left me without an explanation. She is a woman who has spent years building walls and is only recently letting one person see the other side of them, and that person is me. And I don't think that's something I can walk away from without knowing what it is first. He ate his tacos and went back to work and didn't tell anyone that. She called him the next evening, a Friday, while he and Danny were playing a board game that Danny understood better than he did and was winning. I need to say something, she said, without hello, without preamble, which was very Victoria. About last night. Okay. He made a losing move and Danny crowed. He held up a finger 1 second, and Danny sighed with the theatrical suffering of a 6-year-old asked to pause a board game. I don't want to pretend that conversation didn't happen, Victoria said. I've been thinking about it all day, and I know my instinct is to walk it back, find some way to make it smaller than it was, tell you I was tired and the headache, and it was nothing. A pause. But it wasn't nothing. No, Brian said. It wasn't. I don't know what it is either, she said. I want to be honest about that. I'm not offering you something to find. I genuinely don't know what this is. That's okay. Is it? He thought about it, actually considered the question rather than answering reflexively. Yeah, he said. I think we can just keep going and see what it is. We don't have to name it right now. A beat of quiet. Dad, Danny said from across the board game, with the careful enunciation of a child who has been patient for long enough. One more second, bud. Back to Victoria. I should go. Danny's destroying me at a board game, and I'm being unsportsmanlike by taking a phone call mid-loss. She laughed. A real one this time, not the small escaped sound from before. Actual laughter, brief but warm, and it hit him somewhere below the sternum like a chord played in a key he recognized. Go lose your board game, she said. Yeah. He paused. Victoria. I'm glad you called. A beat. Me too, she said. December settled into a rhythm between them that was new but not tentative, more like two people who decided, without announcement, to stop pretending they were something more casual than they were. She came to his building one afternoon that second week. Not inside, just out front, because she'd been walking from a lunch meeting nearby, and the cold was doing something particular to the city, that early winter quality where the air had a clarity to it that made everything look more real than it usually did. He came downstairs in his coat, and they walked together for 40 minutes without a destination, moving through the neighborhood, past the coffee shops and the vintage stores and the building with the mural that someone had been adding to for years. And they talked or didn't talk in roughly equal measure, and it was comfortable in a way that still surprised him, that this woman with her driver and her 6-bedroom house and her private equity firm was easy to walk in silence with. What were you like at 32? He asked at some point. She thought about it. Afraid of things I hadn't admitted I was afraid of. Ambitious in a way that left no room for anything else. Daniel and I had been married for 4 years, and Chloe was 2, and I was not fully present for most of it. I thought I was. I wasn't. What were you afraid of? Stopping, she said. Same as now, I suppose. The specific fears change, the habit stays. What's the specific fear now? She looked at him sideways as they walked, a look that was both measuring and unguarded. The combination that he'd come to understand was her version of being seen. That I've spent so long being good at the thing I built, she said, that I've forgotten how to want something I didn't build, something that just happened. He didn't answer right away. They passed a dog park where two golden retrievers were chasing each other with absolute commitment. This happened, he said. Yes, she said. It did. They walked for another half block without speaking. Is that okay? He asked. She was quiet for a moment, then, ask me that again in a few weeks. He could live with that. The weeks did what weeks do. Christmas came and went. Brian's mother made her standing rib roast and Brian brought Danny, and they sat around the table on the south side with Beverly's sister and her husband and their grown kids, and Danny fell asleep under the table at 9 o'clock, which was a Carter family tradition he was continuing from his father. Brian watched his son sleeping under the table with a paper crown askew on his head and felt the specific ache of Christmas, which was always a compound feeling, the warmth of the room and the food and the noise of people who'd known you your whole life, layered with the awareness that some part of the life you'd wanted to build for Danny wasn't there and might not be the shape you'd imagined. Victoria was in New York for Christmas. She'd mentioned it briefly. Her sister lived there, the only family obligation she kept without question. She texted him on Christmas morning, "Merry Christmas, how's Danny?" And he'd sent a photo of Danny in his pajamas destroying wrapping paper with scientific intensity. She'd written back, "He looks exactly how Christmas morning should look." And then, after a moment, "Merry Christmas, Brian." He'd felt the distance of the city between them more clearly than he would have expected, not painfully, just clearly. She was back in Chicago by the 28th, and on the 29th, which was a Sunday and Danny was at a play date, she called him and said, "There's a thing I want to show you, if you have time." The thing was a jazz club in the South Loop she'd been coming to for 15 years, a narrow basement room called Meridian that barely held 40 people and had exposed brick walls and a stage the size of a large kitchen table, and on Sunday afternoons ran a session that started at 2 and went until 6. She had 2 drinks and he had one, and they sat at a small round table close enough to the musicians that he could see the pianist's hands. They didn't talk much during the music, which didn't feel strange. The music was the kind of thing that made conversation seem beside the point. At some point in the third set, she leaned slightly toward him to say something about the bass player. She knew his name, knew he'd recorded with 3 separate legends, said it quietly with a kind of private enthusiasm that was different from her professional self, more unguarded, more alive. And Brian was very aware of the closeness of her, the warmth of her shoulder almost touching his, the way she was lit by the low stage light that made everything in the room look amber and particular. He didn't say anything about it. He just turned and listened to the bass player and let the moment be what it was. But later, when they came up out of the basement into the January cold of the South Loop, and both of them gasped a little at the temperature, she reached out and briefly took his arm to steady herself on the icy step. Automatic, practical, just for a second, and neither of them commented on it, and neither of them moved fully apart after. They walked to where her car was parked, and Marcus was there, patient as always, and she stopped at the door and looked at Brian in the way she'd been looking at him recently, the way that was becoming harder to read as neutral. "Same time next month?" she said. It meant the jazz club. She was offering it as a recurring thing. "Yeah," he said, "definitely." She nodded once, got in the car. He walked to the bus stop in the cold and waited for the 62, and thought about her hand on his arm on the icy step and the amber light on her face during the bass solo, and didn't try to organize any of it into a conclusion. His coworker Jenny, who sat 2 desks over and had a particular gift for noticing things people were trying not to notice, said to him one afternoon in January, "You seem better." He looked up from his desk. "What?" "Like, when you came back after the thing with your girlfriend, you were, I don't know, present, but not really present." She tilted her head. "You're back now. Something changed." "I'm fine," he said, which was his standard answer and meant very little. "You're not just fine," she said. "You're lighter. Are you seeing someone?" "No." Are you in the process of beginning to maybe see someone? Jenny, she pointed at him. That's a yes face. That is not a yes face. That is a please stop face. Those look the same on you. She turned back to her computer, satisfied. Just checking. For the record, whatever it is, keep doing it. You've been easier to be around. He didn't respond to that. But he turned back to his drawings with the corner of his mouth doing something involuntary, and Jenny didn't say anything about it, which was the most generous thing she could have done. The thing nobody told you about something new, something that was building in the specific complicated way this was building, was how much of it happened in between the notable moments. Not at the jazz club or on the winter walk, but in the texts at odd hours, in the phone calls that started as 5-minute check-ins and ran to 40. The ordinary connective tissue of two people becoming part of each other's daily thinking. She asked about his projects and he asked about her deals, and they asked about each other in the specific way that meant, I was thinking about you earlier and wanted to know how you were and couldn't find a better way to say that, so here's a question. She told him about a negotiation that had been running for 6 weeks and finally closed, and he could hear the exhaustion and the satisfaction in her voice in approximately equal measure. That particular tone of someone who has pushed hard for something and gotten it and now needs to sit down. He told her the Wicker Park edition had gotten a mention in a trade publication, and she made him send her the link and wrote back 3 specific things she liked about the design, and one thing she thought they could have pushed further, which was, that was very Victoria. Most people said congratulations and moved on. She actually looked. There was a night in mid-January when Danny had a nightmare and woke up crying at 2 a.m. Brian had gotten him back to sleep after an hour, lying in Danny's small bed with his arm around a kid who weighed almost nothing and shook a little in his sleep even after the crying stopped. And when Danny was finally solid under, he'd gone back to his own room and couldn't sleep, and he'd picked up his phone without really thinking about it. He didn't text Victoria. It was 2 a.m, and she was not the person you texted at 2 a.m. They were not there yet. Wherever they were going, they hadn't gotten to 2 a.m. texts. But he thought about doing it. He thought about how, if he did text her, she would probably be awake. She didn't sleep enough. She'd admitted this once, offhandedly, the way she admitted things she'd decided were just facts rather than problems. She'd probably be in her study with the lamp on and the legal pad and the laptop, working or reading or both. He thought about what he would say, probably just, Danny had a nightmare. He's okay now, just couldn't sleep. And she would probably write back, is he okay? And he would say, yeah, he's fine, just shaken. And she would say something specific and real, not just that's hard, something that would actually land. That was what she did. He didn't send it, but he stayed with the thought of it, the ease of it, how natural it felt to imagine reaching toward her in that particular tired and tender hour, and understood that what was happening between them had gotten past the point where it was something he could look at from the outside. He was in it. Whatever it was, he was in it. The dinner was her idea. She texted on a Thursday. Cook for me Saturday. I'll come to you. I want to see where Danny lives. He read the message twice, and then, you want to come to my apartment. Is that strange? He thought about his apartment. The Lightning McQueen chair, the drawings on the table, the 6-year-old who would have approximately 40,000 questions for any adult who entered the premises. He thought about Victoria Hale, who navigated boardrooms and international deals and ran a company with 300 employees, sitting on his second-hand couch while Danny explained the rules of a card game he'd invented. It's not strange, he wrote. It's just a very different environment from what you're used to. Good, she wrote back. That's the point. Danny, when informed on Friday evening that someone was coming to dinner Saturday, said, who is she? Brian considered this. A friend. Your friend? Yes. Danny looked at him with the evaluating expression he'd recently developed, the one that suggested he was running calculations. Is she a girlfriend? She's a friend, Brian said. A friend who's a woman. You'll like her. How do you know I'll like her? Because you like most people. Danny considered this accurate and dropped the subject. Victoria arrived at 6:15, exactly when she said she would, because she was always exactly when she said she would be. She stood in the doorway of his apartment in a dark wool coat and looked around the entryway, the hooks with Danny's backpack and Brian's work jacket, the shoes lined up imperfectly, the drawing taped to the wall that Danny had made of a rocket ship, with an expression that was quiet and unreadable for a moment. "Come in," Brian said, which was obvious but felt necessary. Danny appeared from behind Brian's leg with the sudden appearance of a child who has been waiting behind a corner. He looked at Victoria with complete seriousness. "Hi." "Hi," Victoria said. She crouched down a little. Not all the way, she wasn't a croucher, but enough to level herself toward him. "You must be Danny." "Yeah." A pause. "Do you like penguins?" Victoria glanced briefly at Brian, who had no help to offer. "I think they're very interesting animals." Danny appeared satisfied by this answer, nodded once like a small executive approving a proposal, and disappeared back into the living room. Victoria straightened and looked at Brian. "Interesting," she said. "Not underrated, not amazing. Interesting." "He gives that answer to adults he's still deciding about," Brian said. "How do I pass?" "Time, mainly. And you can't try too hard. He sees through effort." Something shifted in her expression, a small private humor. "Smart kid." "Scary smart sometimes," Brian said. "Come in." He'd made pasta with a proper sauce, not jarred, actual tomatoes and garlic and the Italian sausage he'd gotten from the butcher on Armitage, and a salad and garlic bread, which was not haute cuisine but was real food made with attention. Victoria sat at the kitchen island while he finished it, and they talked while he cooked, and Danny came in and out of the kitchen with the casualness of someone who owned the place, occasionally inserting a fact about penguins or the rules of the card game or complain about something that had happened at school that week. At one point, Danny climbed onto the stool next to Victoria and said, without preamble, "My mom doesn't live with us." Victoria was quiet for a beat. "I know," she said. "Your dad told me?" "She moved away," Danny said. "But I see her." "That's good?" "Dad was sad for a while." "Danny?" Brian said from the stove. "He was," Danny said. Not defensively, just accurately. "But he's not as sad now." Victoria looked at Danny for a moment. "I'm glad to hear that," she said, and the way she said it, low, real, not performing warmth for the child but actually meaning it, made Brian turn back to the stove and busy himself with something that didn't need attending. Dinner was the three of them at the table with Danny's drawings pushed to one end, and Danny asked Victoria about her job in the way children ask about adult jobs, which is to say he wanted to know what she did all day and whether she got to use a computer. She described her work to him in terms he could understand. "I help companies figure out what's going wrong and try to fix it." And Danny said like a doctor, but for companies. And Victoria said yes, actually, exactly like that, with a note of real surprise that a 6-year-old had nailed it. By 7:30, Danny was drooping, and Brian took him to brush teeth and change, and Danny, in the particular graciousness of a tired child, did not fight about bedtime, which was so rare it was almost suspicious. Brian read 2 pages of a chapter book, and then Danny was gone. And Brian stood in the doorway of the small room, looking at his son in the glow of the nightlight. The rocket ship on the wall, the penguin poster his grandmother had given him, the stuffed bear that was still in bed even though Danny maintained he was too old for stuffed animals, and felt, the way he sometimes felt when Danny was asleep, something large and quiet moving through him that didn't have a clean name. He went back to the kitchen. Victoria was still at the table with her wine glass, and she'd moved 2 of Danny's drawings in front of her and was looking at them, really looking, the way she'd looked at the penguin project on his phone. "He draws everything in motion," she said when Brian sat back down. "Did you notice? Nothing is still. The rockets are always mid-flight. The animals are always running or eating or doing something." Brian looked at the drawings. He'd seen them so many times they'd become furniture to him. He looked at them now through her eyes. "I hadn't noticed that," he said. "It's a kid who sees everything in action, like the world is always in the middle of something." She set the drawing down carefully. "It's good. It's a healthy way to see things." He looked at her across the table. "You're good with him," he said. "I'm out of practice with children," she said. "I was probably more tense than I seemed." You didn't seem tense." "I was." She looked at her glass. "I spent the whole dinner trying not to say anything that sounded too formal. I kept starting sentences and then rerouting them because I thought, I don't know, I didn't want to be the strange adult at the table." "You weren't," Brian said. "He told you his dad was sad." "Yes. He doesn't tell that to strange adults." She was quiet for a moment. He said, "You're not as sad now," she said. She said it carefully, like she wasn't sure she was allowed to. "I'm not," Brian said. "Not like before." She looked at him across the table, and the kitchen was warm and Danny was asleep 12 feet away, and outside the city was doing its winter night thing. And whatever the distance had been between them when she walked in the door was not the same distance now. "Victoria," he said. "Don't," she said quietly. "Not as a shutdown. More as a request. Like not yet, not here, not with whatever this is still forming." He nodded. "Okay," he said. She picked up her wine glass, and he picked up his, and they sat for another hour in the kind of conversation that covers everything and nothing and moves the way time moves when you're not fighting it, slowly and then all at once. And when she finally said she should go, it was past 10, and neither of them was surprised it was that late, only that it had happened without the hours making themselves felt. He walked her down to the street. Marcus was there, idling at the curb. She turned to him at the door of the car, and they were very close in the way you are close on a city sidewalk in winter. And she looked at him without saying anything for a moment, and he didn't say anything either, and the city moved around them. She put her hand on his arm. Just for a second, just briefly. The same way she had on the icy jazz club step, the same pragmatic automatic warmth, except that this time neither of them pretended it was about balance. "Thank you for tonight," she said. "Thank you for coming." She nodded once, got in the car. He stood on the sidewalk in the cold, watching the navigator pull away until the taillights turned the corner, and then he went back upstairs and stood in his kitchen for a while looking at the drawings she'd moved to look at them more closely, still where she'd left them at the edge of the table. He didn't move them back. He left them right where she'd put them and went to bed, and he lay in the dark and listened to the city and thought about a woman who'd learned to run from things and was slowly deciding to stop. He thought about the fact that whatever was building between them was something neither of them had planned, and neither of them could quite name, and neither of them, apparently, was willing to walk away from. He thought about Danny saying, "He's not as sad now." He fell asleep with the window cracked an inch against the cold, the city coming in quiet and steady, and for the first time in a long time the falling asleep was easy. Not because everything was figured out, because almost nothing was. But because something was present that hadn't been there before. Something warm that had arrived without announcement and settled into the space that grief had cleared and was making itself at home. February came the way February always came to Chicago. Without apology, without softening, just a hard gray fact of a month that the city absorbed with its usual flat stoicism. The lake was frozen out past the breakwaters, and the wind came off it in long horizontal sweeps that made your eyes water before you'd taken 3 steps outside. People moved through it with their heads down, not complaining, just enduring, because that was what you did with February in Chicago. You endured it and waited. Brian had stopped waiting for things to make sense and started just letting them be what they were. That was the shift. Not dramatic, not a decision he'd announced to himself or anyone else. Just a quiet internal adjustment that happened somewhere between the dinner at his apartment and the last week of January when Victoria had called him from a car on her way back from the airport at 11 at night, still in her travel clothes, and talked to him for 45 minutes about nothing consequential, and he'd sat on his couch in the dark and laughed more than he had in months. He hadn't planned this. He was clear-eyed about that. There was no version of the story where Brian Carter, 32, junior draftsman, single father with $19 in his checking account, and a recurring check engine light, looked at Victoria Hale, 55, CEO of a private equity firm, mother of the woman who'd walked out on him, and thought, yes, this makes obvious sense. It didn't make obvious sense. It made the specific kind of sense that only existed inside the thing, invisible from the outside, the kind that you couldn't explain to anyone without them frowning and saying, "Are you sure about this?" Marcus had asked him, actually. The second time he'd been driven somewhere, Victoria had sent the navigator to bring him to a dinner they'd planned when his car was acting up again, and Marcus had picked him up and at some point during the ride had said, eyes fixed on the road, voice neutral, "You know she doesn't do this." Brian had looked at the back of Marcus's head. Do what? Send me for people. I've been driving for her for 9 years. She doesn't send me for people. Brian hadn't answered that. He wasn't sure what to do with it except note it and carry it quietly, which was what he did. What he did with most of it, in those February weeks was carry it quietly and let it accumulate. And in the spaces between the practical obligations of his life, the work, the Danny logistics, the alternator check engine light that turned out to be an oxygen sensor and cost $60, and his own labor from a YouTube tutorial, he thought about her. He thought about her the way you think about someone who has gotten into the frequency of your daily mind, who exists in your peripheral awareness, whether you're actively thinking about them or not. He'd be reviewing a floor plan and catch himself wondering if she'd eaten. He'd be helping Danny with homework and she'd surface for no reason at all. Not a specific memory, just her, the fact of her, the weight of her presence in his life that had grown from a text in a parking lot to something he couldn't have mapped beforehand. He told Marcus eventually, when they were almost at the restaurant. "I know." Marcus had nodded once, said nothing else. Numb. The first time she touched him, intentionally, not the adjusting on ice steps kind, not the brief hand-on-arm kind, was a Saturday afternoon in early February at her house. She'd asked him over to look at something in the back of the garden. There was a structural issue with the stone wall that bordered the property, and she'd gotten 2 contractor estimates that conflicted in ways she found suspicious, and she wanted a second set of eyes, specifically a set of eyes that understood load-bearing structures. He'd come over and they'd stood in the cold garden for 20 minutes while he looked at the wall, and she stood beside him with her coat pulled tight and listened while he explained what was wrong and why one estimate was probably padding and the other was probably right. Afterward, inside, warming their hands around coffee in the kitchen, she'd reached out without looking up from her mug and pushed his sleeve back to look at the scrape on his forearm. He'd caught it on the rough edge of the stone while examining a joint, and had said, "That's bleeding a little," and had gone to a drawer and gotten a bandage and put it on his arm with the matter-of-fact efficiency of someone who'd done it before, for other people, and then hadn't let go of his arm right away. It was 3 seconds, maybe 4. She was looking at the bandage, and then she looked up, and they were very close, and neither of them had planned it, and neither of them looked away. "Victoria," he said. "I know," she said, quietly, not stepping back. He turned his arm over slowly in her hand, not pulling away, just shifting, until his hand found hers, and they stood in the kitchen with the winter light coming through the window and the coffee going cold on the counter, and neither of them said anything at all. She was the one who eventually moved, but not away. She moved toward him, a small, careful, deliberate movement, like a decision being made in real time, and leaned her forehead against his shoulder, and he stood very still because it felt like something that would break if he wasn't careful. They stayed like that for maybe a minute. "This is complicated," she said, into his shoulder, not looking up. "I know. Chloe, I know. The age, Victoria," he said it gently. "I know all of it. I've been knowing all of it for months." She lifted her head, looked at him directly, which she always did. She didn't look away when things were difficult. She looked straight at them. It was both one of the most challenging and most trustworthy things about her. "I'm not 28, she said. "I have a daughter your age. I have a whole architecture of a life that's already built. I'm not a person who fits easily into someone else's life." "I'm not asking you to fit easily," he said. "Nothing about this has been easy. I'm not sure easy is the point." She looked at him for a long moment. "What is the point?" she asked. He thought about the parking lot, the Tom Kha soup, the jazz club, and the amber light. Danny explaining penguins. Her hand on the drawing she'd moved to look at them more closely. "I think the point is that something real is happening," he said. "And I'd rather know what it is than not." She was quiet. Then, "I haven't wanted someone in a long time. I want to be honest with you about that. Not because I've had relationships since Daniel, but I kept them at a certain distance because it was easier, and nobody pushed the distance far enough that it became a problem." She held his gaze. "You push. Is that bad?" "I don't know yet." She stepped back then. "Not all the way. Just enough. I'm going to need time to know." "Okay," he said. "You're not frustrated by that?" "I'm a man who's been letting this develop for 4 months without naming it," he said. "I think I can wait." Something moved through her face. Not quite a smile, but the precondition of one. "The patience on you is unfair," she said. "Years of single parenting," he said. "You get good at waiting things out." She laughed, the real one, the one that was still new enough that it surprised him every time. February moved forward. The distance between them contracted by degrees, not dramatically, not in the ways that make for easy storytelling, but in the ordinary accumulations of two people who have decided, without fully saying so, to let the thing be the thing. He began to understand her habits. The way she processed stress by going very quiet, the opposite of what most people did. Instead of talking more, she went still. And you had to understand that the stillness wasn't absence. It was her doing the internal work that other people did out loud. The way she called him when she was in transit, in cars or the back of cabs or waiting at airport gates. Because those were the windows where the schedule didn't fill every available moment. The way she sometimes sent him articles or photographs without comment, just the link, just the image. And those were her way of saying, I thought of you without saying it in words. He learned that she read obsessively, mostly history and biography, and that her opinions about books were sharp and fully formed and delivered without preamble. He learned that she hated being late more than almost anything, that she considered punctuality a basic form of respect and lateness, a form of saying, my time is worth more than yours. He learned that she had a complicated relationship with Chloe that she mostly managed by not examining it too closely. A functional distance, a we talk on birthdays arrangement that passed for a relationship because neither of them demanded more from it. And Chloe, that was the thing that sat at the base of everything, the fact that didn't move no matter how they arranged everything else around it. Victoria mentioned her infrequently, and when she did, it was usually oblique, a reference to the past, a behavioral pattern, a context. She'd called once in January, and the call had been brief, the vocal evidence filtering through that Victoria's side of the conversation was measured and careful. And after she'd hung up, she'd been quiet for a few minutes before she'd said, she's in New York. Sounds like she's doing well. Brian had said, good, because he meant it. He wanted Chloe to be well. He wasn't carrying a grudge. The hurt had been real, but it had changed shape over time, and whatever it was now wasn't anger. What it was, he realized somewhere in those February weeks, was distance, the genuine kind. Chloe had receded from the center of his emotional life and been replaced, or rather had vacated a space that something else had moved into. He wasn't sure Chloe knew about him and Victoria. He was sure Victoria hadn't told her. He didn't push that conversation. He knew it was coming. There was no version of this that didn't eventually require it. But there was a difference between knowing a conversation was necessary and being ready for it, and neither he nor Victoria was ready for it yet. They were still too much in the middle of figuring out what they were to each other to begin explaining it to the person who had the most complicated stake in the answer. Marcus, when he drove Brian to the Lincoln Park house one Wednesday evening, said, she told her housekeeper you were coming for dinner. First time she's ever told Elena to prepare for a guest. Brian looked at the back of Marcus's head. Marcus's face in the rearview mirror showed nothing. Marcus, Brian said, are you keeping track? I drive, Marcus said. I notice things. Is that your way of telling me something? A pause. She's a good woman, Marcus said. That's all. I know that. Good. End of discussion. The dinner that Wednesday was the first time Brian stayed past midnight at the Lincoln Park house. They'd eaten at the Kitchen Island. She'd ordered from a Thai place 2 streets over, actual good Thai, and they ate out of the containers the way people eat when formality has mostly stopped being necessary, and talked until the food was gone, and then kept talking because the talking was what they were there for, or part of what they were there for, or what they were willing to admit they were there for. She told him about Daniel, her ex-husband, Chloe's father. She'd mentioned him before in fragments, but this was more the actual story, the shape of a marriage that had started well and degraded slowly, not through catastrophe but through neglect, the way things die that don't have water. They'd been ambitious in parallel, she said, not together. They'd aimed at the same horizon and raced each other toward it without realizing that racing wasn't partnership. By the time Chloe was 8, they were 2 people who co-owned a house and a child and a social calendar, and had stopped being 2 people who were actually in each other's lives. Why didn't you fix it earlier? Brian asked. Because I thought the problem was temporary, she said. I thought we'd just get through the busy period and then reconnect. I kept telling myself after this deal, after this quarter, after Chloe starts school full-time. There was always an after. She was quiet for a moment. And then one day, Chloe was 12, and Daniel said he'd been seeing someone for 2 years, and I realized the after I'd been waiting for had passed without me noticing. I'm sorry, Brian said. Don't be. It was what it was. We were both at fault. She looked at her wine glass. The part I carry is Chloe. She watched us not be in each other's lives, and she learned that that was what marriage was. Two people being efficient together. She paused. I think it's part of why she runs. She never really saw anyone stay. Brian was quiet. You stayed, he said. I stayed in the house, she said. That's not the same thing. He looked at her across the island. You're staying now, he said. In this. Whatever this is. You keep not running. She held his gaze. I keep almost running, she said. There's a difference. Yeah, he said, but almost is doing the work, almost is a choice. Something moved through her expression that was harder to read than usual, layered, uncomfortable, like he'd named something she hadn't been willing to look at directly. You're going to make me actually feel things, she said, and it came out half wry and half like a genuine warning. Sorry, he said, not sorry. No, you're not. No, he agreed. I'm not. She looked at him for a long, quiet moment, and then she reached across the island and put her hand on his. Not briefly this time, not transitional, just present, and left it there. He turned his hand over. They sat like that in the warm kitchen with the city outside doing its winter thing, and the clock moved toward midnight and then past it, and neither of them called it late. March arrived like a door opening in a stuffy room. Not warm yet, not even close, but different. There was more light. You could feel it in the quality of the afternoon, the way the shadows fell differently, and Brian noticed it on his walk home from the bus stop one day and thought, something has shifted. He was not thinking about the weather. 3 weeks into March, he was in the middle of a revised structural plan for a commercial renovation in River North when his phone rang, and it was Victoria, and she said, without preface, I want to show you something. Can you come Saturday? Bring Danny if you want. He'd left the offer on the table, if you want, which was her being careful because she was still careful about Danny, still conscious that being in a 6-year-old's life carried weight that you couldn't easily undo. He thought about it for approximately 4 seconds and then called his mom and asked if she could have Danny for the afternoon. Why? Beverly asked. I'm going to Victoria's. A pause that had a specific texture. Okay, his mother said. I'll take him to the museum. He drove to Lincoln Park on Saturday morning, and Victoria met him at the door and led him through the house. He'd only ever seen the kitchen and the hallway and the study she'd shown him once, briefly, and through the back and out through the garden's rear gate, which opened onto a narrow service alley and then a gate on the other side. And on the other side of that was a property. It was a narrow 2-story brick building, a former coach house from the era when the neighborhood's graystone mansions had needed places for horses and carriages. It was in serious disrepair. The windows were boarded, the brick needed repointing, the roof had a visible sag in one corner. But the bones were there. You could see them. The proportions were good. I bought it 6 months ago, Victoria said. She was standing next to him with her hands in her coat pockets looking at the building. I've been trying to figure out what to do with it. Brian was already walking the perimeter, looking at the foundation, the roof line. What are you thinking? I'm not sure. A space I could use for something. Maybe a studio. Maybe I rent it. She paused. I thought you'd be able to see things I can't see. He looked at the building for a long time. Then he looked at her. You want me to design something. I want you to tell me what's possible, she said. Whether there's something worth saving here. He looked back at the building. Yeah, he said. There's something worth saving. They spent 2 hours on the coach house. He took photos on his phone, noted the structural issues, asked her questions about use and budget, and what the light was like in the different seasons because that changed everything. And she answered with the precision she brought to all practical problems, and they moved through it together, 2 people with different kinds of knowledge, making a third thing that was better than either one alone. On the way back through the garden, she said, You lit up. What? When you were looking at the building, you lit up. She said it simply, an observation. You don't look like that when you're talking about work. The work at the firm is other people's visions, he said. I'm executing someone else's decisions mostly. That, he gestured back toward the coach house. That's a problem that doesn't have an answer yet. You like problems that don't have answers yet. Doesn't everyone? No, she said. Most people like answered questions. They like certainty. She looked at him. I like answered questions. I'm very good at solving defined problems. And undefined ones? She held the garden gate for him. I'm working on it, she said. And then April came. The garden behind Victoria's house began to show the first evidence that it had been designed by someone who understood how things grew. Small, early bulbs pushing up along the stone path, something green and tentative at the base of the wall that had needed repointing. Brian had drafted a preliminary plan for the coach house. Nothing formal, just sketches, done at his own kitchen table on a Sunday while Danny built something elaborate with blocks on the floor. He'd brought them to Victoria one Wednesday evening, spreading the papers across her dining room table, and she'd leaned over them with the focused attention she gave everything, asking questions that were better than his answers sometimes, pushing at assumptions he hadn't realized he'd made. At one point, she'd reached past him to point at something on the drawing, and her hair had brushed his face, and neither of them commented on it, but both of them had gone briefly still. They were getting very good at being in the almost without resolving it. He understood why, or most of it. The Chloe question. The age. The structure of her life, which was genuinely complex and not easily made room in. And something else he'd started to sense, that Victoria Hale had been disappointed before in ways that had changed the wiring, that she'd built the controlled executive self over something that had been hurt, and she was protective of it, not out of selfishness, but out of a very earned understanding of what it cost when things went wrong. He wasn't going to push. He'd meant it when he said it, and he still meant it. But he was also not going to pretend. He'd stopped pretending around week 6, and he wasn't going back. The night it broke open was the second Thursday of April. It had been building all week, not between them, but in the surrounding pressure, the things neither of them was saying accumulating until the room they were in couldn't hold them comfortably. A deal she was working had gone sideways, and she was carrying it like a stone, visibly tired in a way she didn't usually let show. He'd had a difficult week, too. A project review that had not gone the way he'd hoped. Some harsh feedback from the firm's senior partner that he was processing with the slow burn of a person who knows the feedback is partly right and doesn't like it. They were at her house. The kitchen again, which was their room, the room where they always ended up, with the lamp on and the legal pad and the coffee gone cold on the counter. The storm had been building since late afternoon, an actual storm, not a metaphor. A serious line of thunderstorms moving up from the south that had turned the sky an unusual yellow-green before going dark. The rain started around 8. Within 20 minutes it was heavy, the kind of sustained downpour that made the city sound different. All the ordinary street noise swallowed up and replaced by the white noise of water on everything at once. Lightning came in long intervals, not dramatic, just the periodic brightening of the windows, the delayed thunder rolling through. They were talking. Not about anything particular, the conversation moving the way it moved between them, from his project feedback to her deal, to something she'd read about urban green space that connected to the coach house, and then sideways from there. And somewhere in the middle of it, she'd said something that stopped him. He couldn't remember later what the sentence was exactly, some observation about the coach house design, about the way light would move through the west-facing window she'd wanted to expand, and she'd said, I keep imagining sitting in there in the morning with coffee when it's like that, when the light is just starting to move, and she'd stopped, caught herself, and he'd understood. She'd been imagining it with him in the picture. She'd been picturing a life that included him, and the sentence had gotten loose before she could catch it. She was looking at the counter. Victoria, he said. I know, she said. I know, I didn't mean... Stop, he said gently. Stop taking it back. She looked up at him. You don't have to keep taking it back every time something gets close, he said. I'm not going to run with it somewhere you don't want to go. But you also don't have to. Every time something real gets said, you don't have to immediately walk back into the controlled version. He paused. It's exhausting to watch. She was very still. It's exhausting to do, she said quietly. Then stop. She held his gaze for a long moment, and the rain was hitting the windows in waves, and the thunder was somewhere in the middle distance, and the lamp was making everything in the kitchen the particular gold it always was. And she looked at him the way she'd looked at him in this kitchen before, in December, the look that was undefended and complicated and tired of being anything else. "I want," she started, stopped. "Tell me," he said. She looked at him steadily. "I want this to be something," she said. "Not undefined, not whatever this is. I want it to be something real. I know the complications, and I know why I know all of it, but I've been careful my whole life, and I think I've been careful in ways that cost me things, and I don't—" She stopped again. Then, "I don't want to be careful with you anymore." Brian looked at her for a long moment. "Okay," he said. "That's all? What else do you need me to say?" She laughed once, surprised, and then he crossed the kitchen to where she was standing, and she didn't move back, and he took her face in his hands, and she let him. He kissed her. It wasn't the first almost moment between them. There had been so many of those stacked up over months like cards. But it was the first actual moment, and it was slow and real and not performed for anyone. And when they pulled back, she had her hands at his chest and was looking at him with something that was not the executive and not the careful woman, and not any version of herself she'd been managing. Just her, just Victoria, just the actual human being who'd been in there the whole time being protected by all the rest. "Hi," he said quietly. She almost laughed again. "Hi," she said. Outside, the storm had picked up, rain driving sideways against the glass, the thunder closer now. Inside the kitchen, the lamp held its ground. They stayed in the kitchen, close but not rushed, talking low the way people talk when something has shifted and they're finding the new register of it, and it was almost 10 when the doorbell rang. They both looked toward the hallway. Victoria frowned slightly. "I'm not expecting anyone." She went to the intercom by the back hallway, the one that connected to the front door camera, and looked at it, and Brian watched her face. He watched the color leave it. Not slowly, immediately, like something had been switched off. "What?" he said. She didn't answer for a second. She was looking at the intercom screen with an expression he had never seen on her, something between shock and dread, the expression of a person whose two separate worlds have just arrived at the same address. "It's Chloe," she said. The storm outside sent a crack of thunder through the house, close enough that it vibrated in the walls, and Brian felt something go cold in his chest that had nothing to do with the weather. He hadn't moved from where he was standing in the kitchen. He looked at Victoria, still looking at the screen. He thought about the 4 months of careful distance from Chloe, and the months before that of not understanding, and the 12 words of a text message at 11:47 on a Tuesday, and the thing that had grown in the space the leaving created. And he thought, of course it's now. Victoria pressed the intercom button. "Chloe," she said. Her voice was even. It cost her something to make it even. "Come up." She released the button. She and Brian looked at each other across the kitchen, and the rain came down hard outside, and the lamp held its ground, and neither of them spoke because there was nothing left to say that would fix the next 60 seconds. The front door opened, footsteps in the hallway, the kitchen doorway, and then Chloe Bennett was standing in it, wet from the rain, her coat dripping, her bag over her shoulder, and she looked at her mother, and then her eyes moved across the kitchen and found Brian standing there, and the expression that crossed her face was something Brian had never seen from her either in 3 years of knowing her. It was not anger, not yet. It was the raw, unprocessed shock of someone who has just found two worlds colliding that she had believed were separate, who is trying to make sense of what she's seen while still in the doorway, still wet from the rain, still holding her keys. The three of them stood in the kitchen, in the silence that existed between the thunder going and the next thing, whatever the next thing was, arriving. Nobody spoke. The storm kept coming. The silence lasted maybe 5 seconds. It felt much longer. Chloe stood in the kitchen doorway with rain still dripping from her coat, her keys in her hand, and her eyes moving between her mother and Brian with the specific stillness of someone whose brain is receiving information it hasn't yet decided how to process. She looked younger than Brian remembered, or maybe just more unguarded. She'd taken the red-eye from New York, he'd find out later, an impulsive decision made that afternoon, and the travel was on her face, the tiredness, and underneath it something that was already cracking open before she'd had time to prepare for what she'd walked into. Victoria spoke first. "Chloe," her voice was careful and level, the same voice she'd used on the intercom. "I didn't know you were coming." "I know." Chloe's voice was flat, not cold yet. Flat, the sound of someone buying time. Her eyes settled on Brian. "Hi, Brian." "Hey," he said. It came out quiet. She looked at him for a moment, really looked, the way you look at something you're trying to categorize, and then her eyes went back to her mother, to the two of them, to the kitchen, the lamp, the coffee cups, the particular arrangement of two people in a room who have been close and whose closeness is readable to someone paying attention. "What is this?" she said. Victoria moved away from the counter slightly, not toward Brian, not toward Chloe, just a small neutral repositioning, which was probably unconscious and probably the worst thing she could have done, because it looked like distancing, like creating space between herself and the evidence. "Come sit down," Victoria said. "You're wet. Let me get you—" "Mom," Chloe's voice sharpened. "What is this?" "It's not—" Victoria stopped, began again. "Brian and I have been—" "How long?" A beat. "Chloe, how long has he been coming here?" Victoria was quiet for a second too long, and that second did the work of a full sentence. "Since November," Brian said. Both women looked at him. Victoria's look was complicated, not grateful, not accusatory, somewhere in between, the look of someone watching a decision being made for them that they hadn't finished making themselves. Chloe's look was direct and sharp, and had something behind it that wasn't quite anger yet, but was the thing that came directly before. "November," Chloe repeated. "His car broke down in a parking lot," Victoria said. "I had Marcus drive him home. That's how it started." Chloe set her bag down on the kitchen floor slowly, carefully, like she was putting something dangerous down rather than a bag. She took off her wet coat and hung it over the back of a chair, movements deliberate, buying herself time, which Brian recognized because he did it too, that physical busywork of managing yourself while something difficult was arriving. "You've been talking to my mother," Chloe said to Brian, "for 5 months." "Yes." "And you didn't—" She stopped. "You didn't think to tell me." "Tell you what," he said. Not aggressively, honestly. "We weren't together. You ended it. You didn't give me a way to reach you after that." Something moved through her face at that, a flinch almost, like it landed. "That doesn't mean you just—" She gestured at the room, at them. "This." "Chloe." Victoria's voice was steadier now, the initial shock organized into something more functional. "Sit down, please." "I don't want to sit down." "Then stand." "But don't do this in the doorway." Chloe looked at her mother for a long moment, and Brian watched the specific dynamic between them. The friction of two women who had spent years maintaining a careful, managed distance from each other, and who were now in the same room with something that removed the careful management. Chloe moved to the island, not sitting, just leaning against it with her arms crossed, facing them both. "Okay," she said. "Explain it to me." Victoria looked at Brian briefly. He didn't know exactly what the look meant. Maybe I'll take this. Maybe help me. And he let her take it, because it was hers to take. "I helped him in November," Victoria said, "and we started talking, texting, calling. It built into something. I didn't plan it, and I know that doesn't matter, but it wasn't something I engineered. It happened." "It happened," Chloe repeated. The flatness was gone from her voice now. Something with more edge was moving in. "You're 55 years old, and it just happened." "Yes, with my ex-boyfriend." "He was your ex," Victoria said. "You ended it. You didn't—" "That's not the point, and you know it." "Then what is the point, Chloe?" Victoria's voice didn't rise, but it hardened slightly at the edges. "Tell me what the point is." "The point is that he was mine." She said it, and then heard it, and something shifted in her expression. Not retraction exactly, but recognition that the word had revealed something she hadn't meant to reveal. She pushed forward anyway. "For 3 years he was a person in my life, and you went around me." "I didn't go around you," Victoria said. "You left him in a parking lot in November with a broken car, and you'd already cut contact. What would going around you even mean?" "It means you don't call your daughter's ex-boyfriend, and I didn't call him. I texted him because Marcus saw his car, and then he needed help, and I helped him, and something came from that. A pause. Something I wasn't looking for. Chloe turned to Brian. The sharp thing in her expression was fully arrived now, the anger past the edge and active. "Did you do this to get back at me?" she said. Brian had been standing quietly against the far counter, giving space, waiting, and the question hit him somewhere that made him straighten. "No," he said. "That's not what happened." "Then what happened?" "Your mother is a good person," he said. "She helped me when I needed it, and we talked, and she made me feel like a human being at a point when I was struggling. That's what happened. I wasn't thinking about you. You'd been gone for 4 months and you hadn't explained anything, and you weren't there." He paused. She was. Chloe absorbed this. He could see her absorbing it. The jaw working slightly, the eyes moving down and then up, the particular expression of someone integrating information they don't like. "She's my mother," she said. "I know who she is." "Do you? Because it seems like you just—" She made an open, frustrated gesture. "How did this not occur to you as a problem?" "It occurred to me as a complication," he said. "That's not the same as a problem." "Brian, Chloe," he said her name quietly and directly. "You sent me a text, 12 words, 3 years and 12 words, and then your number went to voicemail, and that was it. I spent 4 months trying to figure out what I did wrong." He held her gaze. "And now I know I didn't do anything wrong, because you do this. You run when things get complicated. And I waited for you to come back or explain or anything, and you didn't. What did you expect me to do with the rest of my life?" The kitchen was quiet except for the rain still hitting the windows, reduced now from the storm's peak to a steady, persistent drumming. Chloe looked at him for a long time. When she spoke again, the anger was still there, but something else had entered, something more complicated, something with more layers. "I didn't think you'd find my mother," she said. It came out small, almost raw. Not a complaint, not a volley, just the actual truth of it, what was underneath the anger. "Neither did I," he said. A silence. She turned away from both of them then, looking at the window, the dark glass and the rain, and Brian could see the line of her shoulders, the tension in them, and underneath the anger she was something else. She was, he understood, in pain. Not just from tonight, from longer, from the whole architecture of a thing she'd walked away from without looking back, and then had to live with having walked away from, which was the part of running that didn't get talked about. The running didn't end the hurt, it just relocated it. "I don't understand," she said, still facing the window. I don't understand what you are to each other." Victoria spoke. "I care about him," she said. Chloe turned around slowly. The look on her face was something Brian had never seen in 3 years of knowing her. It was not the anger. It was something below it, shocked almost, and hurt in a register that was different from anything the evening had produced so far. Because the anger you could maintain from a distance. What her mother had just said couldn't be held at a distance. It came right in. "You care about him," she said. "Yes." "Mom." "I know," Victoria said. "I know how it sounds. I know what this looks like from where you're standing. I'm not telling you it's simple or that there are no complications or that you shouldn't be upset. I'm telling you the truth because you deserve the truth, and I'm done managing this situation." She paused. "I've been careful my whole life. With your father, with work, with you. I've been so careful that I've kept everything at a managed distance, and I have a daughter I talk to 4 times a year because we've both been so careful around each other that we forgot to actually be in each other's lives." Her voice was steady, but it had gone somewhere vulnerable in the last sentence. "Brian doesn't let me be careful. He pushes past it, and I needed that. I didn't know I needed it until it was happening." Chloe stared at her mother. Something was working through her face that was complicated to read. Hurt and confusion, and something else underneath that, something older, the particular ache of hearing your parents say they've kept you at a distance and recognizing that you've kept them there too, that the distance was a two-way thing that neither of you fully built alone. "I didn't—" She stopped, started again. "It was easier to keep it surface level. After Dad. After you and Dad." She paused. "You were always working, and I was always—" She made a short, frustrated gesture. I didn't want to need something you couldn't give. I know, Victoria said quietly, and I'm sorry for that. The apology landed in the room with unexpected weight. Victoria was not a woman who apologized easily. Not from stubbornness, but from the particular psychology of someone who operated in control and found the vulnerability of an apology genuinely costly. Chloe heard it the way you hear something rare. Her eyes filled and she blinked it back because she was also not someone who let things show easily, which was perhaps the most Victoria trait she carried. You still should have told me, she said. Her voice had lost most of its edge now. What was underneath was not softer exactly, just more honest. I know, Victoria said. I was afraid of this. Of me being upset? Of losing you both, Victoria said. At the same time. Chloe looked at her for a long moment. Then she looked at Brian. Did you love me? She said. Directly. No preamble. When we were together, did you actually love me, or was it... Yes, Brian said. I did. I don't think you doubt that. She nodded once. No, she said. I don't. A pause. Did I love you? He held her gaze. I think you did. I think you got scared and you ran before it could hurt you, but I think you did. She looked at the floor. That's probably true, she said quietly. The admission came out different from anything else she'd said tonight. Stripped of defense, just honest. The kind of thing you say when you've stopped performing the version of yourself and are just being the actual person. Brian looked at her. Really looked, for the first time in the months since she'd been gone, and saw not the woman who'd sent the text and disappeared, but a person who carried something she'd been carrying for a long time. A learned pattern of protecting herself by leaving before she could be left. A thing she'd inherited from a household where people stayed in rooms without being present and called it stability. He wasn't angry. He discovered this somewhat to his own surprise. Standing in his ex-girlfriend's mother's kitchen in the middle of an April thunderstorm, looking at Chloe after 5 months of silence and 12 words and a grief he'd carried longer than he'd admitted, he was not angry. He was sad, in the way you're sad for something that was real and had ended, but the anger had gone. It had been replaced, or used up, or maybe just become unnecessary when he hadn't been paying attention. Chloe, he said, I'm not your enemy. She looked up at him. I know, she said. I know that. And your mother isn't either. She looked at Victoria. Her mother looked back at her. There was so much between them, so many years of managed distance and surface-level conversations, and things said sideways rather than directly, and it was all in the room, not resolved, not healed, just present and visible in a way it hadn't been visible before. Chloe started, stopped. I need to not be in this room for a minute. The study is... I know where the study is, she said, not unkindly. I'll be back. She picked up her bag from the floor and went down the hall, and her footsteps on the hardwood faded, and then the door of the study opened and closed. Victoria and Brian were alone in the kitchen. Neither of them spoke for a moment. She sat down at the island, which was unusual. She almost never sat in the kitchen. She stood, she moved, she was always in some relation to motion. She sat down and put her elbows on the counter and pressed her palms to her face for a moment. Not crying, just holding herself for a second. He went and sat across from her. You okay? He said. She dropped her hands. Her face was tired and complicated and real. Ask me in an hour, she said. Okay. They sat in the quiet of the kitchen with the rain outside and the study door down the hall closed, and Brian thought about all the ways a person could spend years building a careful life and then have it rearranged in a single rainy Thursday night. He thought about the fact that Chloe was down that hall right now in the study he'd seen once, probably sitting in the dark or not in the dark, processing something that had rearranged her night just as thoroughly. He thought about what she'd said. I didn't think you'd find my mother. And the way he'd answered, neither did I. Both of them had told the truth. After about 20 minutes, Victoria said, I should go talk to her. Yeah. Brian. She looked at him across the island. I meant what I said, to her, all of it. I know you did. I just want you to know that I said it because it was true, and not because the situation forced it. I was going to say it. Not tonight, maybe. Not like this, but she paused. It was going to be said. He looked at her. I know, he said. Go. She went. He sat alone in the kitchen for a long time. He made himself a glass of water and stood by the window where the rain was still coming but softer now, the storm having spent most of itself, and he looked at the garden in the dark. The early spring growth barely visible, the stone path, the gate that led to the coach house with its sagging roof and its redeemable bones. And he felt the particular weight of a night that had cracked something open. Not destroyed it. He didn't feel like anything had been destroyed. He felt like something had been exposed. The way a structure gets exposed when you tear the walls down for renovation, all the wiring and the plumbing and the things that had been hidden because it was neater to hide them, and now they were visible and you had to deal with them. He could hear, very faintly, voices from the study. Not the words, just the cadence. Two women talking, the rhythm of conversation that was not an argument, the back and forth of something more painful and more necessary than an argument. He didn't try to hear the words. That was not his room to be in right now. He was there for another hour before Chloe came back to the kitchen. She came in and looked at him, and her eyes were dry but reddened, and she'd changed into something dry from her bag, a soft sweater. And without her wet coat, and with the anger mostly spent, she looked, again, younger. Or more herself, maybe. More the person he'd known before the managing had taken over. She sat down across from him at the island where Victoria had been sitting, and for a moment neither of them said anything. She told me, Chloe said, more than what she's said in here. The whole... since November. The car, the soup thing, the jazz club. She paused. She told me about the coach house drawings. Brian nodded. I didn't know she did jazz clubs, Chloe said. It came out slightly bewildered. I didn't know she... I knew about Meridian, she's mentioned it, but she never invited me. She stopped. She took you there. She did, he said. Chloe absorbed that. There was something in it that was about more than jealousy, more about the specific ache of discovering that your parent has a life you didn't know about, interests and habits and vulnerabilities they never showed you, and understanding that the distance between you was not just geography or busyness, but something more structural, something that had been built over years by both parties. She's different with you, Chloe said. She said that, about herself, that she's different. I don't know what she's like with other people, Brian said carefully. I only know what she's like with me. I know what she's like with other people. She's like what you'd expect a CEO to be like. Capable, controlled, very competent, very much not present in the room. She was quiet for a moment. I've been talking to my mother for 20 years and she told you more in 5 months than she ever... She stopped. That's not your fault. I know that. It's not hers either, he said. Not entirely. Chloe looked at him. I know, she said. We had a whole... She gestured toward the hallway. In there, we went places we haven't been in about 15 years of trying to do everything on the surface. A pause. She cried. My mother. I've seen her cry maybe twice in my life. Brian was quiet. I don't know how I feel about you, Chloe said. Specifically, about you and her. She said it directly, without heat. I don't know if there's a version of me that's okay with it. That's honest, he said. Thank you for being honest. I'm trying, she said. She looked at the counter. I know I hurt you. With the text, with the not explaining or talking or any of it. Her voice changed register on that, became less steady. I've been telling myself it was the right thing to do because it was easier than admitting I was scared, but it wasn't the right thing. I know that. What were you scared of? He said. She looked at him. Of the same thing that always happens, she said. Of it not working. Of one day looking up and it being like my parents. 2 people in the same house going separate directions and everyone calling it a marriage. She paused. You were getting serious. Danny was getting attached. And I thought I couldn't give you what you needed, and one day you'd know that, and it would be worse than leaving now. Brian sat with that for a moment. You could have told me, he said. I know. That's all I ever wanted, Chloe. The actual truth. You didn't have to stay if you didn't want to. You just could have told me. I know. Her voice went quieter. I'm sorry, Brian. I mean that. What I did was wrong, and I've known it for months, and I've been... She stopped. I've been dealing with it in my particular way, which is to not look at it. Yeah, he said. That tracks. She made a short sound that was almost a laugh and almost wasn't. You know me too well. I knew you for 3 years. Yeah. She looked at the window. How's Danny? He's great. He's obsessed with penguins and he's destroying me at every board game he owns. She smiled at that, small and real. He was always too smart for you. For everyone, honestly. A silence that was somehow less complicated than the ones before it. I don't know how to do this, she said finally. Be okay with this. I'm not there yet, and I don't know if I get there. She looked at him. But I know my mother. I know how she keeps people out. And if you're in... She stopped again, picked the sentence back up. She needs someone who doesn't let her manage them. She's been managing everything for so long. A pause. She needs someone who stays. I intend to, Brian said quietly. Chloe looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked down at the counter and nodded once, slowly, the way you nod when you've decided to accept something that's still costing you. When Victoria came back into the kitchen, the three of them existed in the same room without the explosive charge of earlier, not comfortable, not resolved, but past the worst of it. The air had changed, not cleared. It would take more than one night to clear. But the storm had exhausted itself, the way storms do. And what was left was the damp quiet afterward. Victoria looked at Brian first, a quick look that carried more than words could carry in front of Chloe, and then at her daughter. I'll make tea, she said, which was the most domestic and Victoria thing she could possibly have said, practical to the last, finding a concrete action to put her hands to while the emotional landscape reorganized itself. Nobody objected. She moved to the kettle and they let her, and Chloe looked at the counter and Brian looked at the garden through the dark window. And outside the rain had gone to almost nothing, just the drip from the eaves and the sound of water moving in the gutters. It was not a resolution. Brian understood that clearly. Chloe's acceptance, such as it was fragile and conditional, and still working out what it meant in practice. The relationship between Victoria and her daughter was going to require more than one night in a kitchen with a thunderstorm providing the drama. And what he and Victoria were to each other, the thing she'd named as something real, the thing he'd been moving towards since November, was still in early formation, still tender, still learning its own shape. But the 12 words on a Tuesday night had led, in their particular way, to this kitchen, to this table, to this woman filling a kettle with water, and to a conversation with her daughter that had gone to places both of them had avoided for 15 years. And none of that was what Brian would have planned for any version of his life. But plans were not what you got. You got what happened, and what you did with what happened, and whether you were brave enough to let it mean something. He thought of what Victoria had said in the study. I've been careful my whole life. He looked at her at the counter, her back to them, the careful line of her shoulders that was not quite relaxed but was less armored than it had been 3 hours ago. He thought, she's not running. For the first time in a long time, neither was he. Chloe, across the counter from him, looked up and caught him looking at her mother, and something moved through her face. Complicated, layered, not peace exactly, but the thing that came before peace when you were honest enough to look at the whole picture. She looked back down at the counter. She didn't say anything, but she didn't leave either. The kettle came to a boil. Victoria set 3 cups on the counter. Outside, the last of the storm moved east, and the city began its slow recomposition. The street sounds returning, the wet pavement catching the first light of clearing. Somewhere in the neighborhood, a car moving through a puddle and sending a small wave of water up against the curb. 3 people sat in a kitchen, holding warm cups, carrying separate versions of the same night. The hard part had been said. The harder part, living with what had been said, building something from the ruin of the old arrangement, finding out whether forgiveness was a thing that could be chosen before it was fully felt, that was still ahead. But they were all still in the room. For now, that was enough. Chloe left the next morning. She'd slept in her old room, the one Victoria had kept the same for years, not as a shrine, but out of the particular inertia of a woman who traveled too much to think about redecorating rooms nobody used. And Brian had gone home around midnight, driving through the rain-washed streets with the windows cracked and the city looking scoured and clean, the way it always did after a serious storm. He'd sat in his parking spot for a few minutes before going up, not ready to be inside yet, needing the open air a little longer. He didn't know what the next weeks would look like. That was the honest truth of where he sat in the car at 12:30 in the morning. Not pessimistic, not optimistic, just genuinely uncertain in the way you are when something has been broken open and you don't yet know what the opening means. What he knew was this. Victoria had said it out loud. In front of her daughter, in a kitchen with a storm outside, she had said, "I care about him," without flinching and without walking it back. And that was not a small thing for a woman who had spent the better part of 2 decades carefully managing what she let anyone see. He knew that Chloe had heard things in that study she'd needed to hear for 15 years. Painful things, true things, the kind of things that don't fix the damage immediately but make the damage visible, and visible damage is at least damage you can work on. And he knew that when he'd driven away from Lincoln Park, the light in the study was still on, and the light in the kitchen, and somewhere in that house 2 women were in the same rooms actually talking, which was something neither of them had reliably done since Chloe was 12 years old. He went upstairs and checked on Danny, who was a sprawled, unconscious monument to the total commitment of children's sleep, one arm hanging off the bed and the penguin poster watching from the wall. Brian stood in the doorway for a moment, doing the thing parents do, just looking, just confirming the fact of them, and then went to bed. He slept better than he expected. Chloe texted him the next day from the airport. It was brief and direct, which was very her. "I need more time, but I don't think you're a bad person, and I don't think she made a wrong choice. I just need time." He wrote back, "Take all you need, I mean that." She didn't respond, which was fine. He hadn't expected her to. He told Victoria about the text when she called that afternoon. She'd been quieter than usual on the phone, not distant, just processing, running on less sleep than usual with the particular emotional weight of a night that had rearranged things. She said, "She hugged me this morning before she left. An actual hug. Not the, we usually do this thing that's technically a hug, but is more like 2 people briefly occupying the same space." A pause. This was different. "That's something," Brian said. "It's a start," she said carefully. She was not going to oversell it. That was the right call. "It's a very small start." "Small starts are still starts." She was quiet for a moment. "You holding up?" she asked. "Yeah," he said. "Are you?" "Working on it." A beat. "Brian." "Yeah." "I want to see you, not tonight. I need a few days to sit with things, and there's a board call tomorrow that's going to be brutal. But I want to see you." "Saturday," he said. "Saturday," she agreed. He hung up and stood in his kitchen looking at the drawings Danny had done that Victoria had moved to study them, still at the edge of the table where she'd left them. He'd kept them there. He hadn't examined why. It wasn't conscious, just something he'd left alone the way you leave certain things alone, because they're right where they are. The weeks that followed were not easy, and Brian stopped expecting them to be. There was a social weight to what was happening that he felt in ways both practical and invisible. He told Marcus, not deliberately, Marcus just appeared to already know, and was giving him a look one afternoon that required acknowledgement. "She's happy," Marcus said, with the particular economy of a man who needed no further elaboration. "I haven't seen her happy in a long time." Brian nodded, and Marcus went back to driving, and that was the entire conversation. And somehow it was enough. He told Jenny at the office, which was a decision he made because Jenny was going to notice anyway, and he preferred the direct version to the observed version. Jenny sat with it for a moment, a long moment, the kind where you could see the gears turning, and then said, "How old is she?" He told her. She nodded slowly. "And she's your ex's mom?" He confirmed. Another long pause. "Is she good to you?" He said yes. Jenny said, "Then I don't actually have a problem with it, but you should be prepared for other people too." He was. Or he was getting prepared. He told his mother properly, not the half admission of November, but the full version, over dinner at Beverly's on a Sunday in April while Danny was watching a show in the other room. His mother listened with the steady attention of a woman who had raised 3 children and operated a school for 30 years, and was genuinely difficult to surprise. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Is this what you want?" "Not what happened to you. What you want." "Yes," he said. She nodded once. "Then I'll meet her when it's time." A pause. "She's Chloe's mother." "I know." "That's a complicated thing." "I know that too." "Okay." Beverly Carter picked up her fork. "More potatoes?" His mother's version of acceptance, he'd learned over 32 years, looked like continuing to eat dinner. He took the potatoes. Marcus drove him to Lincoln Park on Saturday afternoon. The coach house was unlocked when they arrived. Victoria had left it open, and Brian went in alone while she finished a call inside the main house. He stood in the gutted space with his preliminary sketches in his hand and looked at what was there and what could be there, and he thought about structures, about what you kept and what you opened up, and what you built new and what you left alone, because it was the thing that made the whole thing worth keeping. The west wall, the one with the window she'd wanted to expand, had good bones. The light would do exactly what he'd told her it would do. Morning light pooling across the floor, moving through the day, the quality of it changing by the hour. You could build a life in that light. A working life, a real one. The kind where you went somewhere that was yours and you made things and the light moved and you were present in it. He was still standing there when he heard the gate open. Victoria came through in her coat, still holding her phone, which she pocketed when she saw him. "Sorry," she said. "Tokyo. They don't always observe the time difference. It's fine." He held up the sketches. "I've been rethinking the east wall." She came and stood beside him and looked at where he was pointing, and they fell into it naturally. The design conversation, the practical back and forth of problem and solution. And it occurred to him, standing in the shell of an old coach house on a Saturday afternoon in April, that this was also love. Not just the dramatic version, not just the kitchen at midnight and the things said out loud during storms. This too, the standing side by side in a gutted space, pointing at walls, building something from what was there. "Tell me what you're thinking," she said. He told her. She listened and pushed back where she had opinions, which was in several places, and he adjusted where she was right, which was in most of those places. By the time they went back into the main house, the rough shape of the renovation had changed twice from his original sketch, and was, he thought, considerably better for it. In the kitchen, making coffee, she turned from the counter and said, "I talked to Chloe again. Thursday." He waited. Longer than normal, an hour. She poured the coffee and turned around. Her expression was careful, but underneath it something that was not quite relief, but adjacent to it. She had questions about how it started, about the timeline. She was not warm. I'm not going to tell you she was warm, but she was engaged. She wasn't managing the conversation from a distance. She was actually in it. "That's good," Brian said. "She asked about you." Victoria looked at him steadily. "Whether you were serious, whether this was..." I think she wanted to know if it was real or if it was something I'd talked myself out of. "What did you tell her?" "That I wasn't talking myself out of anything." She held his gaze. "That I was done talking myself out of things." He looked at her across the kitchen that had become the room where things got said, where things got broken open, and also where things got made, where the lamp held its ground and the coffee went cold while they talked past midnight, and the storm came and the storm went. He thought about the parking lot in November and the 12 words in a text message and his forehead against the steering wheel and the 14% phone battery and the particular gray of a rain-soaked Wednesday and how that day had opened, slowly and without his permission, into this one. "Can I ask you something?" he said. "Always," she said. "What do you want? Not what you're willing to try or what you think might work. What do you actually want?" She set her cup down on the counter. She didn't answer right away. This was one of the things about her he'd come to trust. She didn't answer until she had the real answer, not the available one, not the answer that was easiest to give in the moment. "I want mornings," she said finally. "Not every morning. I know what my life is, and I know it's complicated, and I'm not asking for something impossible. But some mornings. Coffee before the calls start. Maybe the coach house when it's done. I want to read something and tell you about it and have you actually want to hear it. She paused. I want to know Danny a little better, not as an obligation, because he's a person I find genuinely interesting, and he made me feel welcome in a way I didn't expect, and I'd like to keep being someone who gets to know him. Another pause, smaller. I want to not be careful all the time. I want a place where the careful version isn't required. Brian looked at her. That's everything I want too, he said. Basically exactly that. She looked at him for a moment, and he watched her let it in. The particular challenge of Victoria Hale, the thing he'd been watching her practice since November, the act of receiving something without immediately finding a reason to hand it back. She didn't hand it back. Okay, she said. Okay, he said. May came. The garden behind the Lincoln Park house came into actual color. The tulips that had been tentative in April went fully open. Something that might have been an early rose made an exploratory appearance near the south wall, and the trees that lined the property threw shade in the afternoons in a way that changed how the whole space felt, made it more interior, more private. Brian brought Danny on a Saturday afternoon in May. It was not orchestrated. He'd been over to look at the coach house progress. Pete, the mechanic turned occasional handyman, had connected him with a contractor friend who was doing good work at a fair price, and Danny had been with him because his mom had a birthday party conflict, and Beverly was visiting her sister, and Danny had taken one look at the inside of the coach house and announced that he wanted to help, which meant standing next to Brian and handing him things that didn't need to be handed and asking questions about every tool and material he could see. Victoria came through the gate from the garden at some point and found them in there, and Danny turned around and looked at her with the particular evaluation he gave all adults the first several times he encountered them. You're the interesting animal lady, he said. Victoria blinked once. I'm sorry? Brian stifled something. He means you asked about his penguin project. Oh, Victoria said. Yes, that's me. Danny nodded, apparently satisfied with the confirmation. There's a crack in that corner, he told her, pointing at a spot in the plaster near the floor. Dad says it's not structural. Is that right? Victoria crouched down to look at the crack. How do you know? Because it's going horizontal, Danny said. Structural ones go up and down. Victoria looked at him, then at Brian. He's been in the back seat for a lot of site conversations, Brian said. I see, she said. She looked back at the crack. Your dad's right. It's not structural. Danny accepted this verdict and went back to organizing a pile of sample tiles that he had appointed himself to organize by color, which was not a task anyone had given him, but which he'd decided was necessary. Victoria straightened up and came to stand beside Brian, and they watched Danny work for a moment. He's remarkable, she said quietly. I know, Brian said. He terrifies me sometimes. She smiled. Not the controlled version, the real one. Good, remarkable, she clarified. The best kind. Danny looked up from his tiles. Are you coming to the park after? He was looking at Victoria, not Brian. Victoria. She looked at Brian. A quick check. He gave no indication either way. This was Danny's question and Danny's call. If you want me to, Victoria said. Danny turned back to his tiles. Yeah, he said casually. There's a good section near the water. I can show you. And that was that. No ceremony, no negotiation, no drama, just a 6-year-old who had decided in his private accounting of the world that a person had passed enough tests to be included in a park visit. Brian thought, not for the first time, that children had an instinct for real versus performed that adults spent years trying to recover. The three of them went to the park. Danny ran ahead on the path the way he always did, that specific mode of child locomotion that is not quite running but is faster than walking. The motor always a little ahead of the body. He took Victoria to the section near the water he'd mentioned, a small pond at the south end of the park where there were actual ducks, which he'd been tracking across multiple visits and had strong opinions about, and explained the duck situation with a thoroughness that Brian recognized as his son's version of trust. You didn't give the full duck briefing to people you hadn't decided about. Victoria listened to the duck briefing with complete attention. Brian walked a step behind them and watched, and felt something move through him that was not easy to name. Not happiness, exactly. Or not only that. Something more like, this is real. The specific weight of a thing that is actually happening. The three of them on a path in a park on a May afternoon, the city making its city sounds beyond the tree line. A 6-year-old pointing at ducks, a woman who'd spent a decade being careful leaning on a railing and nodding seriously at everything he said. Real things felt different from imagined or hoped for things. They had more texture. They were less symmetrical. They didn't resolve into clean pictures. They were just there, particular and imperfect and ongoing. He was standing inside one. He put his hands in his pockets and watched his son and this woman he was building something with. And he thought, okay, not as a conclusion, as an arrival. He thought sometimes about what he'd learned from the whole sequence of it, from the parking lot to the park, from the dead battery and the 14% and the cold rain to this afternoon, these ducks, this specific quality of May light. He thought about how the things that change your life don't announce themselves. They don't come with a signal or a warning label or a moment of cinematic clarity. They come as a text from an unexpected number in a grocery store parking lot. They come as a soup recommendation at 10 o'clock on a Tuesday. They come as a woman you barely know sending her driver to pull you out of the rain for no particular reason, which turns out to be the beginning of something that reorganizes your entire understanding of what you were looking for. He'd spent a long time after Chloe left trying to understand what had gone wrong, running the calculation, looking for the error, the variable he'd missed. And what he understood now, from the other side of it, was that the question was wrong. There was no error to find. Chloe had been a real relationship with real feeling in it, and it had ended badly and without explanation. And that was genuinely painful and genuinely unfair, and he'd needed to feel both of those things fully. But it had ended because she wasn't ready to stay, not because he hadn't been enough. That was the part that took the longest, not believing it intellectually. He'd believed it intellectually fairly early, once Victoria had told him plainly what he suspected. But actually releasing the version of the story where there was something fundamentally wrong with him that he'd missed, where he'd been insufficient in some way that the leaving confirmed. That version of the story had more grip than he'd realized, and he'd had to actively choose, many times, not to go back to it. What nobody tells you about grief, not just romantic grief, but any kind, the grief of loss and failed expectation, and the life you thought you were building that turned out to have a different floor plan, is that it doesn't end. It changes. It recedes. It becomes less like a weight on your chest and more like a room in the house that you don't go into as often, but the room is still there. You just stop living in it. He'd stopped living in that room somewhere around February. He could locate it roughly. He couldn't tell you the exact day because it wasn't a day. It was a gradual accumulation of being known by someone, being asked real questions by someone who waited for real answers, being seen in the particular way that Victoria saw him, without agenda, without wanting something from the scene, just looking and finding the thing that was actually there. That's what love does, at its best. It makes you findable. Chloe came back to Chicago in June, not for any specific occasion. She'd taken a long weekend, she said, just needed to get out of New York, which Brian suspected was not the whole explanation, but which he didn't press. She texted him on the Friday she arrived. "I'm in town. Is it okay if I call you this weekend?" He wrote back, "Of course." She called on Saturday morning while Brian was making breakfast and Danny was still in pajamas, having very strong opinions about what he wanted to eat. Brian went into the hallway with the phone while Danny escalated his positions with the pancake batter. "How are you?" Chloe said. "Good," he said. "Really? How are you?" "Okay." A pause. "Better than 2 months ago." "Yeah?" "I've been seeing someone," she said. It's new, very new, but I thought you should know. I don't know why. Maybe because telling you makes it real. You were always the person I told things to." He leaned against the hallway wall and looked at the kitchen where Danny was now apparently attempting to make pancakes without supervision. "I'm glad," he said. "Is he good?" "He's very different from you," she said, "which is probably the point. Probably smart." A small silence. "I saw her," Chloe said. "Last night, Mom." "How was it?" "Hard," she said. "And good. Both." She paused. "She looks, I don't know, different. Not different like something is wrong. Different, like something is right. She's less, there's less of the managed thing. She was actually nervous, did you know that? Sitting across from me at dinner and actually nervous. My mother, nervous. Another pause. She's never been nervous around me before. She's always just been composed. And I realized that I'd always thought that was because she didn't care enough to be nervous. But maybe it was because she was protecting herself, Brian said quietly. Yeah, he could hear her processing. Yeah, I think so. And she wasn't doing that last night, and it was uncomfortable. And also kind of the first time I felt like I was actually having dinner with my mother instead of a version of her. Brian didn't say anything. He let the sentence breathe. I'm not all the way there, Chloe said. With the situation. With you and her. I want to be honest. I know, I'm not asking you to be all the way there. But I'm working on it. A pause. She's happy. I can see it. And she's been alone for a long time in ways I didn't fully understand until the last couple of months. So, she stopped, tried again. I'm working on it. That's everything, Brian said. Okay. He could hear her take a breath. How's Danny? Currently attempting unsupervised pancakes. I should go. She laughed, real and brief. Go, she said. Take care of yourself, Brian. He paused at those words. 4 words that had come to mean something different to him than they ever had before, because he'd been told them so many times now by someone who meant them. You too, he said. He went back to the kitchen and saved the pancake situation and didn't say anything to Danny about who'd called, and Danny didn't ask. And they ate breakfast at the table with the drawings at one end and the morning light doing what morning light did through the east window and the city starting up outside. And it was ordinary in the specific way that good things are ordinary. Present, sufficient, asking nothing more of you than to be in them. The coach house was finished in late July. Not fully finished? There was still finish work to do, trim and paint, and the flooring in the back section. But the structural work was done, and the west window had been expanded exactly as designed. And on the afternoon that the framing came down and the light came through for the first time at full size, Victoria stood in the center of the room and looked at it and didn't say anything for a long moment. Brian stood to one side and watched her. She was standing in the light with her arms loose at her sides, not crossed, not held, just there, and the light was doing the thing he'd told her it would do, moving across the floor, touching the old brick of the back wall, making the space feel larger than its footprint and older than its renovation. It was a good room. It was going to be a very good room. Well, she said. Yeah, he said. She turned to look at him. You were right about the window. I usually am about windows. She made the face she made at things that were funny, but that she wasn't going to give him the full laugh for. The precondition. Don't be smug about it, she said. I'm not smug, he said. I'm satisfied. There's a distinction. She looked back at the light on the floor. I'm going to put a chair there, she said, pointing at the spot where the light pooled most fully in the morning. And a table, small one. Coffee table height or working height? She thought about it. Both, one of each. He nodded. That was the right call. She turned back to him, and the light was behind her now, and she looked like herself. That was the simplest way to put it. Not the executive and not the careful woman and not the composed CEO version that the world mostly got. Just Victoria, the actual one. Thank you, she said. For this. You paid for it. Not for the building, she said. For all of it. The November parking lot forward. He looked at her. I didn't do anything except show up, he said. That's not nothing, she said. That's actually most of it. He crossed the room to where she was standing, and she didn't move back, which she never did anymore, and he kissed her briefly in the new light of the expanded window, and she put her hand flat against his chest the way she did, and they stood in the room they'd built together out of something that was broken and redeemable, the same way you always build the good things, out of what was already there, with patience, with attention, with the willingness to keep showing up when it would have been easier not to. Here's what Brian Carter understood by the end of it, that loss is not a detour, it is part of the road. Chloe's leaving had not been something that happened to him before his real life started. It was part of the real life, an essential passage, the thing that emptied out a space he hadn't known needed emptying. You can't know while you're sitting in the car in the rain that the car breaking down is the beginning of something. You only know that your car is broken and it's cold, and the battery is at 14% and nothing is going the way you planned. The meaning comes later. It always comes later. The people who run from things are not broken. They are afraid, which is different. Fear is not a character flaw. It's information. What matters is what you do when someone shows up and refuses to let the fear be the whole story, whether you run harder or whether you slow down and let yourself be found. That loving someone is not the dramatic version most stories give you. It is Tom Kha's soup at 10 o'clock. It is someone asking about the specific kind of penguin in a 6-year-old school project and actually wanting to know. It is a woman standing in a broken coach house and seeing what could be there instead of what is. It is a man driving home at midnight with the windows down, not because the night is warm, but because he needs the air, because something has happened to him that he doesn't have language for yet, but that his whole body has already recognized. That complicated is not the same as wrong. The most real things are complicated. They don't fit easily into the stories we tell about how love is supposed to work. The age, the history, the daughter who needed time, the mother who'd forgotten how to want something she hadn't built. None of it was simple, and none of it was supposed to be. Simple things don't cost anything and don't give you anything either. The things that cost are the things that stay. That forgiveness is not an event. It is a direction. You don't arrive at it and stop. You face toward it and keep walking, imperfectly, taking some steps back for every 2 forward. And over time, the facing becomes the thing you are, rather than the thing you are trying to do. Chloe was walking that direction. Victoria and her daughter were walking it together. He understood from the outside that it would not be linear and would not be clean and would sometimes require more patience than felt available. But they were walking, and that the person you become after something breaks you open is not a lesser version, not the consolation prize self, not the one who didn't get what he wanted and had to make do. The person on the other side of the breaking is someone who knows what they were made of. You don't know that before. You can only know it after. Mats. On a Saturday morning in August, the coach house had a chair in it, and a table, small, working height, positioned near the west window where the morning light came through the expanded frame and lay across the floor in that way Brian had described months ago to a woman standing in a gutted space, learning to want something she hadn't built. Victoria was in the chair with a cup of coffee and a book she'd been reading in pieces for 2 weeks. History, a long one, the kind that required attention. And the light was doing exactly what it was supposed to do, moving slowly as the morning moved, touching the brick, changing the quality of the space by the hour. Brian came through the gate from the garden at 9 with Danny, who had a very specific reason for being there. There was reportedly a bird that had been nesting in the gap above the east window frame, a detail Pete had mentioned and Danny had become obsessed with, and he needed to check on it, which required access to the coach house and the particular adult permissions that made access official. Victoria looked up from her book when they came through the door. Danny made a beeline for the east wall and began his bird assessment with professional seriousness. Brian looked at Victoria in the chair in the light, the coffee and the book, her hair loose, her feet tucked under her in a way that was completely informal and completely her, and that he'd seen now enough times that it felt like the realest version of her, this one. The one that existed before the day started and its requirements arrived. She looked back at him. "How is it?" he said, meaning the chair, meaning the light, meaning all of it. She looked around the room, the light on the floor, the brick, the window doing its long morning work. "It's exactly right," she said. He sat down on the work table near the door, and she went back to her book, and Danny made quiet sounds of observation from the east wall, and the morning moved through the room the way morning moves when you let it, slowly, without interference. And outside the city of Chicago was doing what Chicago does in August, alive and loud and full of itself. The lake glinting somewhere to the east beyond the trees, the summer pressing itself into every available hour before September arrived to take it back. It was not a perfect life. There were hard conversations still to come with Chloe, repairs still to negotiate, mornings when the distance between what you hoped for and what was available felt more than it should. There were nights when Brian picked up Danny from school and made dinner and cleaned up and felt the ordinary weight of a life conducted largely alone. And mornings when Victoria's phone started at 6 and ran until midnight, and the version of her that Brian got was the one left over after the day had taken most of it. There were social judgments from people who didn't understand and weren't going to try, and there was the occasional silence between them that lasted a beat too long because something difficult was sitting in it that neither of them had figured out how to say yet. All of that was true. And also, a chair in a morning room. A child observing birds with the intensity of a small scientist. A woman with a book and a coffee and her feet tucked under her, reading in the light of a window they had designed together from a space that had been gutted and left and finally seen for what it could be. The broken car in November. The 14% battery. The rain. The text from an unexpected number. The soup. The jazz club. The amber light. The kitchen and the storm. And the things said out loud at the cost of saying them. All of it had led to this Saturday in August, this ordinary, remarkable morning, these two people who had found each other in the wreckage of something else and built something honest from the pieces. This was not the love story Brian Carter had planned. It was better, because it was real.